Clara Whitmore pressed both hands flat against the dirt and did not get up. Not because she couldn't. Because she had learned, a long time ago, that standing back up only gave Evelyn Harper another reason to knock her down again. The whole town of Willow Creek watched. The feed store owner, the preacher's wife, 3 ranch hands leaning on a post. Not one of them moved. Not one of them said a word. And then a shadow fell across the ground in front of her. A man's boots, dusty still. "Ma'am," said a voice she had never heard before. "You got a name? If this story speaks to your heart, please subscribe to our channel and follow along until the very end and drop a comment telling us what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story has traveled. Every comment means the world to us, and it helps more people find stories like this one." The first thing Cole Maddox noticed about Willow Creek, Montana, was not the mountains or the timber or the wide-open sky that stretched from one end of the world to the other. It was the quiet, not the peaceful kind of quiet that settles over a good piece of land at the end of a long day. It was the other kind, the kind that happens when people have learned to keep their mouths shut. He rode in on a gray horse named Biscuit, trail dust on his coat, 3 weeks of hard travel behind him, and a folded land notice in his breast pocket that had brought him this far north. He wasn't a man who talked much or asked for much. He wanted a small mountain claim, a clean deed, and enough distance from his past to finally breathe without it hurting. That was the whole plan, nothing more complicated than that. He had almost made it to the livery stable when he heard the voice. I said, "Get up. What kind of useless creature sits in the dirt like an animal in front of God and the whole town?" Cole pulled Biscuit to a stop. A woman in a dark blue dress stood in the middle of the main street, her back straight as a fence post, her voice carrying the kind of authority that people spend years teaching themselves to perform. She was somewhere in her mid-40s, handsome in a severe sort of way, and she was looking down at something near her feet, with an expression Cole had seen before, on men who had forgotten that other people were people. The something near her feet was a girl, young, maybe 20. Her dark hair had come loose from its pin, and her dress was covered in dust. She had her hands pressed flat against the ground, and she was not getting up. Cole watched her for 1 full second and understood immediately that this was not the first time she had ended up in this position, and that she had made a calculation, a very specific, very practiced calculation about what would happen if she stood. "Clara." The woman's voice dropped into something quieter, which somehow made it worse. "Do not embarrass me further." The girl named Clara rose slowly. She did not brush the dust from her dress right away. She did not look up. She simply stood there with her shoulders curved inward and waited for whatever came next, the way an animal waits at the edge of a trap. "I gave you one task," the woman said. "1. Deliver the ledger to Mr. Parsons before noon. The clock on that church tower said 5 past when you came dragging yourself back. You think a 5-minute mistake doesn't matter. You think Mr. Parsons doesn't notice. You think this family's reputation runs itself." "I'm sorry," Clara said. Her voice was almost nothing. "The strap on the bag broke, and the papers. I don't want explanations. I want results." The woman Evelyn Harper, Cole would learn her name within the hour, turned toward the small crowd that had gathered, without quite gathering, the way small-town crowds do when they want to watch something, but don't want to be seen watching. This is what happens when you show a girl too much leniency. They forget how to be useful. A few people looked away. A few nodded vaguely, the way people nod when they want to agree with whoever is speaking loudest. The feed store owner found something very interesting to examine on the front of his boot. The preacher's wife smoothed her apron. 3 ranch hands stood near the post and watched with blank faces that Cole recognized as the faces of men who had decided long ago that this particular situation was none of their business. Cole sat on Biscuit and looked at the girl. She still hadn't brushed the dust off her dress. He swung down from the saddle. It was not a dramatic movement. He didn't make it one. He just stepped down, looped Biscuit's reins over the post, and walked across the street. Not fast, not slow, just walking the way a man walks when he has decided to go somewhere. Evelyn Harper saw him coming and turned to face him with the full weight of her composure, which was considerable. "Can I help you, sir?" "No, ma'am." Cole stopped a few feet away and looked past her at Clara. "Just wanted to make sure the young lady was all right." Clara's head came up, just slightly, just enough that he could see her eyes, which were a dark brown and completely startled the way eyes look when someone does something that has no precedent in your experience. "She's perfectly fine," Evelyn said. "This is a private family matter." "I don't doubt it." Cole kept his eyes on Clara. "Are you all right, miss?" Clara opened her mouth, closed it, looked at Evelyn. Looked back at him. "I'm fine," she said. The words were automatic and hollow and entirely unconvincing. "She said she's fine," Evelyn said. "Now, if you'll excuse us." "What's your name?" Cole asked Clara, as if Evelyn had not spoken at all. Something flickered across Clara's face, something complicated and brief, like sunlight on water. "Clara," she said. "Clara Whitmore, Cole Maddox." He touched the brim of his hat. "Pleased to meet you, Miss Whitmore." He held her gaze for just a moment longer than was strictly necessary. Not threatening, not dramatic, just long enough to say, without words, that he had seen what happened, that he was not going to pretend he hadn't, and that she was not invisible to him. Then he picked up Biscuit's reins and walked toward the livery stable. Behind him, he could hear Evelyn Harper resuming her lecture in a lower, more controlled voice, which was a voice, he suspected, that was far more frightening than the loud one. He did not look back. He had learned a long time ago that you do not always help a person by making a scene. Sometimes you help them by simply being the first person to see them. And sometimes, if you're patient, that first moment becomes a door. He didn't know yet that Clara Whitmore would walk through it. But he was beginning to suspect she might. Clara had not slept well in 4 years. It had started the month after her father died, when Evelyn Harper had moved from the guest quarters into the main bedroom and announced, without particular drama, that she would be managing the household finances until Clara came of age. Clara had been 16 then, grieving and exhausted and not yet equipped to understand what was being taken from her. By the time she understood, she had already lost most of it. The Whitmore Ranch was not a small piece of land. Her father, Douglas Whitmore, had spent 20 years building it into one of the most productive cattle operations in the valley. He had been a careful man, a methodical man, the kind of man who kept his books in a leather ledger and checked the figures twice. Clara had inherited his head for numbers. By the time she was 12, she could calculate a season's cattle yield in her head faster than most grown men could with pen and paper. Evelyn had found this useful for a while. Then she had found it threatening. The shift was subtle enough that Clara had almost missed it. The first time she questioned a figure in the ledger, a payment to a supply company that didn't match the invoice, Evelyn had smiled and called it a simple error and corrected it in front of her with such pleasant efficiency that Clara had felt embarrassed for mentioning it. The second time, Evelyn's smile had been a little thinner. By the third time, the smile was gone entirely, and Evelyn had looked at her across the kitchen table with those cool, assessing eyes and said, very quietly, "It is not your place to question my decisions, Clara. Your father left me in charge because he trusted my judgment. I would hate for your behavior to suggest that trust was misplaced." After that, Clara stopped questioning the ledgers out loud. But she kept reading them. She kept reading them very carefully, in her small room at the back of the ranch house. By the light of a lantern, she had to hide under the floorboards during the day, because Evelyn had decided that excessive lamp oil was a luxury they couldn't afford. Clara would pull out the ledger copies she'd made from memory. She had a very good memory, and she would sit on the cold floor and go through the numbers again and again, looking for the pattern she knew was there. The way you know a splinter is in your hand before you can find it. She found it eventually. She found several of them. But finding something and being able to do anything about it were two entirely different problems. And Clara was 17 by then, and alone, and the man who had just been named county sheriff was a friend of Evelyn's, and the lawyer who had written her father's will had moved to Denver the previous spring, and Clara had nowhere to go and no one to go to. So she stayed. She survived. She kept her head down and her numbers hidden, and she told herself that 21 was not that far away, that 3 years was nothing, that she just had to get through it, and then she would have the ranch and the land and the legal standing to do something about what Evelyn had done. She told herself this so many times that it became a kind of prayer, the way people repeat things they need to believe until the believing is all that's keeping them upright. She was 20 now, 1 year left, she could make it 1 more year. The problem with Cole Maddox was that he kept showing up. Clara had expected him to move on. Strangers rode through Willow Creek often enough, miners, traders, men working their way north toward the timber camps, and they came and they went, and they forgot everything they'd seen before they hit the next county line. That was how it worked. That was how it had always worked. Nobody stayed because of her. Nobody had any reason to. But 3 days after she found herself sitting in the dirt on Main Street, she was hauling water from the creek behind the ranch house, when she heard a horse and looked up, and there he was, coming along the south fence line on that gray horse, not hurrying, just riding. He stopped when he saw her, touched his hat brim. Miss Whitmore. Mr. Maddox. She set down the bucket, straightened her back. Old instinct, whenever someone watched her, she braced herself for whatever came next. Are you lost? Might be. He looked toward the mountains. Rode out to see the Calloway claim this morning. The north boundary runs close to this property line, near as I can tell. The Calloway parcel. She thought about it. That's been empty going on 2 years. Old Mr. Calloway moved his family to Oregon after the drought. So I heard. Cole leaned on his saddle horn, not in a lazy way. More like a man being deliberate about taking up less space than he actually occupied. You know this land well. Grew up on it. Your family's ranch. Yes, she said it in a flat, careful way that was not quite confirmation and not quite invitation. He nodded, said nothing for a moment. Then that woman. The one from the other day. She's your stepmother? Clara's jaw tightened. She manages the property until I come of age. Manages, he repeated, very neutrally. Right. Is there something you needed, Mr. Maddox? He looked at her then. Not the quick surface-level look that most people gave her, the kind that slid off her like water and registered nothing. He looked at her the way her father used to look at figures in a ledger, slowly, carefully, with the full intention of understanding what he was seeing. No, he said, nothing I need, just wanted to say good morning. He touched his hat again and rode on. Clara stood by the creek for a full minute after he disappeared around the ridge, the bucket still in her hand, trying to understand why a man saying good morning to her felt like something she had to recover from. Over the next 2 weeks he found reasons. That was the only way she could describe it. He found reasons to be places that were near where she was. He wasn't clumsy about it. She would have spotted that immediately and known what it meant, because Evelyn had sent men to watch her before, young ranch hands paid to report back on who she spoke to and what she said. Cole was nothing like that. He didn't hover or follow or stare. He simply showed up, the way landmarks show up the mountain in the distance, the creek at the edge of the field, consistent and unhurried, and there. He was at the general store the morning she came in to collect the supply order, and he helped her carry the flour sacks to the wagon without being asked. And when the store owner made a comment under his breath about girls who thought they were too good to say thank you, Cole looked at the man with a stillness so complete that the comment was not repeated. He was at the town meeting when Evelyn made her quarterly report to the property association, the one where she spoke warmly about managing the Whitmore estate on behalf of her late husband's daughter, and everyone nodded, and nobody said a word about the fact that the estate's cattle numbers had been declining for 3 consecutive years. Clara sat in the back of the room and watched Cole Maddox, who was seated in the second row, listen to Evelyn's report with an expression of polite attention while his eyes moved, methodically and quietly, to every person in that room as they reacted to what Evelyn was saying. He was watching for the same thing she always watched for. She realized it with a small shock. He was watching for the people who knew something was wrong, but had decided not to say so. After the meeting, she walked out quickly and found him already outside, studying the notice board beside the courthouse door. "The cattle numbers are wrong," she said before she had decided to say it. He turned and looked at her. "The numbers she reported tonight," Clara said, her voice low. "They're wrong. The herd count she gave is 60 head higher than it should be. I don't know if she's inflating the asset count to make the estate look more valuable, or if she's planning to sell 60 head off book and pocket the difference, but the number is wrong." Cole was quiet for a moment. "How do you know?" "Because I count them." She met his eyes directly, which she almost never did with anyone, because eye contact invited attention, and attention invited trouble. "Every week. I walk the upper pasture and the South Creek fields and I count them, and I write the number down, and I've been doing it for 4 years. Why? Because someday I'm going to need the real numbers to prove what she's been doing." He was still for a long moment. Then he said very quietly, "You've been building a case." "Trying to." She looked away. "It doesn't matter if I can't present it to anyone who'll listen." "It matters plenty," Cole said. "A case built right just needs to find the right court." She looked back at him. He was studying her with that same slow, careful attention, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, she did not feel like looking away from it. She felt strangely like it was exactly where she needed to be looking. "Why are you still here?" she asked. "In Willow Creek. You said you were looking at the Calloway claim. You could have moved on by now." He thought about it for a moment. Not like he didn't have an answer, but like he was deciding how much of the true answer to give her. "I'm not done with what I came to look at," he said finally. She didn't ask what that meant, but she thought about it for 3 days afterward. Evelyn noticed. Of course she did. Evelyn noticed everything that moved in Clara's orbit, the way a hawk notices movement in the grass, not because she was interested in Clara's well-being, but because she had spent 4 years ensuring that Clara had as few resources and as little support as possible, and any new element in that landscape required assessment and response. The response came on a Thursday evening. Clara was in the kitchen doing the supper accounts when Evelyn came in and sat down across the table from her, which was unusual. Evelyn did not typically sit at the same level as Clara. She preferred standing, preferred the height and the angle of looking down. "The stranger," Evelyn said. Clara kept her eyes on the ledger. "What about him? You've been speaking with him." "He's spoken to me. On a few occasions." She kept her voice level. Matter of fact, the voice she had trained herself into over 4 years. "He's looking at property in the area. It's a small town." People talk, Evelyn agreed. "Yes, about all sorts of things." She smoothed her skirt with one hand, a gesture that Clara had learned to read the way other people read weather. Smooth and careful meant she was working up to something. "He's been asking around, at the feed store, at the land office." "About the Whitmore property." Clara's stomach pulled tight, but she kept her face still. "He mentioned the Calloway parcel runs adjacent, probably just standard due diligence before buying." Perhaps. Evelyn's eyes were on her, not blinking. Or perhaps someone suggested to him that there was something worth looking into. "I wouldn't know what anyone suggested to anyone," Clara said. "Wouldn't you?" It was not a question. Evelyn stood and moved toward the door. Stopped, did not turn around. "The papers your father signed are very clear, Clara. I have legal authority over this property for 11 more months. Every decision, every account, every transaction. You have no standing to challenge any of it, and anyone who attempts to interfere on your behalf will find that this county's legal structures are quite firmly established." She turned then just slightly, just enough to look at Clara over her shoulder. It would be a shame if a newcomer to this area found himself in the middle of a legal entanglement that cost him not only money but his good reputation. "Don't you think?" Clara said nothing. Evelyn left. Clara sat at the kitchen table and looked at the ledger and waited for her hands to stop trembling, which took considerably longer than she would have liked. She went to Cole the next morning. Not to his face, not directly, she was not capable of that yet. Not the kind of direct approach that involved knocking on a man's door and saying, "I need your help." The words that had been scraped out of her. so gradually she had almost forgotten they existed. She did it sideways, the way she did most things. She arrived at the livery stable at the same time she knew he arrived to tend to Biscuit, and she found a task of her own near the water trough, and she waited. He came around the corner of the stable and stopped when he saw her. Read her face, said nothing, just waited. She threatened you, Clara said. Not directly. She would never do it directly. But she's going to try to make things difficult for you in this county if you keep asking questions. Cole looked at her for a moment. I know. She stopped. You already knew? The land office clerk told me yesterday that the county assessor had flagged my inquiry into the Calloway deed for additional review. That doesn't happen to a standard property search. He leaned against the stable post, arms loose at his sides. It happens when someone with influence makes a phone call. Clara felt something cold move through her. Then you should stop. You should let it go and move on and not. Clara. He said her name so simply, so directly, that it stopped her mid-sentence like a hand on the shoulder. Nobody said her name like that. Nobody said it like it was just a name, like it was a normal thing, to say to a normal person you were in a normal conversation with. I'm not leaving. She will ruin you if she can, Clara said. She's done it before. There was a farmhand 3 years ago who tried to report what he'd seen to the sheriff, and by the time Evelyn was through, he'd lost his position at 2 ranches and been run out of the county on a debt claim that appeared out of nowhere. She has her voice cracked, just slightly, and she pressed her jaw closed and breathed. She has ways, she has connections, she's been building them for years. So have I, Cole said, different kinds maybe, but they hold. She stared at him. Why, she asked, and it came out raw and confused and more honest than she meant it to. Why would you do this? You don't know me. You don't owe me anything. You rode into this town to buy a piece of land, and you could just buy it and leave, and none of this would be your problem. Cole was quiet for a long moment. He looked toward the mountains, the way he often did when he was deciding how much to say. Then he looked back at her. When I was about 12 years old, he said, there was a woman in the town where I grew up. Older, widow, ran a small post office operation out of her house. And there was a man, a well-regarded man, with a lot of land and a lot of friends who had been slowly taking money from her for years through a contract she didn't fully understand. And everybody knew. Everybody in that whole town knew what was happening, because it's not the kind of thing you can hide completely in a small town. They just decided it wasn't their problem. He paused. She lost everything. The house, the post office, everything. Moved away to live with relatives who didn't want her and wouldn't say so. He looked at Clara steadily. I was 12 and I knew it was wrong and I didn't say anything, because I was 12 and I didn't know what to say. I've had a long time to think about that. Clara was silent. I know how to read land records, Cole said. I know who to write to in the federal land office. And I know what forged signatures look like on a legal document, because I've been defrauded myself once, by someone a lot less careful than Evelyn Harper. So, he straightened. I'm not leaving. Clara looked at him for a long moment. The morning was cold and the sky behind him was the particular clear pale blue of Montana at altitude, and she thought absurdly, irrelevantly, that she had not looked at the sky in a very long time. Not just glanced at it, actually looked. There's more than what's in the ledgers, she said. The cattle numbers are just the beginning. The debt she's been calling in across town, the families who borrowed money from the estate fund during bad seasons. I think the interest rates she's charging aren't what was agreed to originally. I think she's been changing the figures on those loan documents, but I don't have access to the originals. Where would the originals be? Her locked cabinet in the office. The one she keeps the key to on her person at all times. Clara hesitated. But there are copies. The families who borrowed would have received copies when they signed. The Hennessy family, the Garza family over on Ridgemont Road. The Beaumont widow. If someone they trusted asked to see them. I'll be neighborly, Cole said. He almost smiled. It was a contained thing, not a big expression, but it reached his eyes, and Clara's chest did something complicated and unfamiliar that she chose not to examine closely. "Be careful," she said, and was surprised at how much she meant it. "Yes, ma'am," he said. "You too." She walked back to the ranch and the sky was still that blue and she noticed it all the way home. It was 2 days later that she found the second ledger. She had been looking for something else entirely, a receipt for a cattle purchase that she needed to cross-reference against the grazing records, when she moved the false bottom of the document drawer in the estate office. She had known about the false bottom for nearly a year, had suspected it was there from the way the drawer depth didn't match the desk's exterior measurements, but she had never had an opportunity to check it. Because Evelyn was almost always somewhere in the house and the risk was too great. But Evelyn was in town that afternoon, at the church committee. She wouldn't be back until supper. Clara's hands were very steady as she lifted the panel. Inside was a ledger she had never seen, smaller than the official estate ledger. Older, the cover was plain brown cloth, unmarked. She opened it and what she saw took her breath. It was a complete, detailed record of every financial transaction Evelyn had conducted since Douglas Whitmore's death. Every transaction, including the ones that did not appear anywhere in the official records. Payments to a lawyer in Helena that Clara had never heard of. Withdrawals from the estate account that were listed as maintenance expenditure, with no corresponding invoices. A land sale, a piece of the original Whitmore parcel, sold 18 months ago that Clara had never been told about and had never consented to. Because her consent was legally required for any sale of estate land over a certain acreage, and she had never She stopped at a specific entry near the middle of the ledger and read it 3 times. Then she sat down on the floor because her legs had stopped working reliably. The entry was dated 14 months ago. It was a substantial payment to a county clerk's office in another jurisdiction entirely, 3 counties away. And beside it, in Evelyn's neat, careful handwriting, were 2 words. Document correction. Clara knew what document correction meant in the context of estate law and the language Evelyn used. She had heard Evelyn use that phrase exactly once, in a conversation she wasn't supposed to have overheard 3 years ago. It meant that something had been changed, on an official document. A legal document. The only legal document in Clara's life that mattered enough to change was her father's will. She sat on the floor of the estate office with the hidden ledger in her hands and understood, in the particular way that understanding comes when a thing you have been slowly suspecting finally arrives with its full weight, that this was not just about money. Evelyn had not only been stealing from the estate. She had changed the will. She had changed whatever her father had actually written, had paid someone in another county to alter the official record, and had built the last 4 years of Clara's life on a document that was not what her father had intended. Clara sat there for a long time. Then she stood up, replaced the ledger exactly as she had found it, rebuilt the false bottom, replaced the receipt she had come to look for, and walked out of the office and closed the door behind her. She did not let herself shake until she was all the way across the yard and behind the barn, out of sight of every window in the house. And then she pressed her back against the weathered boards and breathed, and breathed, and breathed. And thought about a man leaning against a stable post, saying, "I'm not leaving," with a quietness that she was only now beginning to understand was the most solid thing she had encountered in 4 years. She had evidence. She had the numbers she'd memorized. She had the hidden ledger's contents, which she would write down from memory before the day was over. She had Cole talking to the families with loan documents. She had potentially a forged will. She had 1 year left before she came of age and had the legal standing to bring all of it forward. But she also had something she hadn't had 3 weeks ago. She was not alone in it. She pressed her hands flat against the barn wall wood, solid, real, and held on to that. Just that, one thing at a time. She could make it 1 year. She was going to make it 1 year. Clara wrote everything down that same night. She did it from memory, sitting on the floor of her room with the lantern turned so low it was barely more than a glow, her handwriting smaller and more careful than usual because she was using the inside back cover of her Bible. The one place in the house Evelyn had never touched, had never opened. Because Evelyn had a particular relationship with appearances and a Bible belonging to a dead man's daughter, she could be seen rifling through, without it costing her something in the town's estimation. She wrote the date of the entry, the amount, the jurisdiction. The 2 words, document correction. Then she closed the Bible and sat with it in her lap and tried to think clearly, which was difficult because her chest kept doing something tight and involuntary that she refused to call fear, because fear was a luxury she had not been able to afford for 4 years, and she was not going to start now. The will had been changed. That was the thing she kept coming back to. That was the stone at the center of everything. Because if the will had been changed, then everything that followed Evelyn's control of the estate, her legal authority over the accounts. The arrangement that kept Clara suspended in this impossible in-between state, where she owned nothing and could challenge nothing, all of it might have been built on a document that did not say what her father had actually written. She thought about her father, Douglas Whitmore. A careful man, a methodical man, a man who checked his figures twice and kept his word and believed, with a simple and genuine certainty, that the world operated according to fair principles if you behaved according to them yourself. He had married Evelyn 2 years before he died. Clara had been 14. She had tried, because her father loved this woman, to find something to love in her. She had tried for 2 years. She had still been trying when he died, and then the trying had become irrelevant because survival had replaced it entirely. What had he written in the original will? She thought she knew. She thought she had always known, in the way you know things you cannot prove. He would have left the ranch to her, directly, without conditions. Her father believed in simplicity. He would not have built in 18 months of transition or allowed anyone else control over what he'd spent his life building for his daughter. He would have left it to her clean and outright, and trusted her to manage it, because he had watched her do the accounts since she was 12, and he had never once doubted what he saw. So Evelyn had changed it. She had changed it to give herself 2 years of legal control. 2 years to take what she needed. And then, when Clara came of age and the arrangement ended, she would walk away with whatever she'd extracted, and there would be no legal consequence because legally she had been acting within the terms of the document. Of the document she had paid someone to alter. Clara sat with this for a long time. Then she stood up, put the Bible back on its shelf, and went to bed. She did not sleep, but she lay still and breathed and let her mind work through the problem the way her father had taught her, which was to start with what you know, move to what you can prove, and hold everything else in reserve until you had the evidence to support it. What she knew, the hidden ledger existed, the entry existed. The payment existed, what she could prove, nothing yet. Not alone, what she needed, access to the original will. Or proof that the version on file had been altered. Or someone with legal knowledge and connections outside this county who could help her find both. She thought about Cole Maddox lying awake somewhere in his rented room at the boarding house, and she thought about what he'd said about knowing how to read land records and knowing what a forged signature looked like. And she thought that she was going to have to tell him. All of it, not the careful partial version she'd been offering in pieces. All of it. Because she was running out of time in a way she hadn't fully understood until tonight, and the careful approach was going to cost her everything, if she wasn't willing to trust someone before she was ready. She had never been willing to trust someone before she was ready. She was going to have to learn. She found him early the next morning at the north fence line, where he'd told her he would be checking the boundary markers on the Calloway claim. He was there, working methodically along the posts, and he looked up when he heard her horse and waited without moving, which was something she had noticed. He did consistently, he never came toward her. He always waited for her to come to him, as if he understood, without being told, that she needed to control the distance. She dismounted and tied her horse and walked up to him and said, without preamble, because she had decided in the night that she was done with cautious approaches, I found a hidden ledger in the estate office yesterday. There's an entry in it for a payment to a county clerk's office, 3 counties away. 14 months ago. The notation says document correction. I believe she paid to have my father's will altered." Cole was still for a moment. Then he set down the tool he was holding and turned fully toward her. "Say that again." She said it again more slowly, with the specific details she had written in the Bible. The date, the amount, the jurisdiction. Cole listened without interrupting, which was something else she had noticed. He never filled silence with noise the way most people did. He waited until she was completely finished, and then he said, "Helena." "What?" "The lawyer Evelyn paid in Helena. I found his name in the county association records last week. He filed a document amendment on behalf of the Whitmore estate 18 months ago. I thought it was a property boundary adjustment." He looked at her steadily. It wasn't a boundary adjustment. Something happened in Clara's chest. A tight thing loosening, just slightly. Not relief, it was too early and too dangerous for relief, but the particular feeling of a suspicion being confirmed, which is its own terrible satisfaction. "You already knew about the lawyer." "I knew there was a lawyer. I didn't know what he'd filed." He picked up the tool again, turned it in his hands. "We need to see the filed document, the actual text." "I can't access it. It's in Helena. I know someone who can request a copy through official channels. A friend who works in the Territorial Land Office. It'll take a couple of weeks." He looked at her. "Will you be safe here for 2 weeks?" The question startled her. Not because it was unreasonable, but because nobody had asked her a version of it in 4 years. Whether she would be safe. As if her safety were a variable that mattered to the calculation. "I've been safe for 4 years," she said carefully. "That's not the same thing as yes." She looked at him. He looked back. "I'll be fine," she said. "All right." He nodded. "I'll write the letter today." She turned to go, then stopped. Turned back. "The families," she said. "The loan documents." "Did you?"
"The Hennessy family showed me their copy last Thursday," he said.
"The interest rate on their document is 4%. I went to the county recorder's office and pulled the registered copy." He paused. "The registered copy says 9%. Clara's jaw tightened. She had suspected. She had been practically certain. But hearing it confirmed out loud was different from suspecting it, the way seeing a wound is different from knowing there is one. She changed the filed copies. Somebody changed them. Somebody with access to the recorder's office. "The clerk," Clara said immediately. "The county clerk here. His name is Whitfield. He's been to supper at our house 4 times in the last 2 years. Cole looked at her for a moment. "You notice everything," he said. "I had to," she said simply. "I had nothing else." He was quiet. "Then the Garza family, and the Beaumont widow." "Check theirs too. Already planning to." He met her eyes. "We're going to need more than the loan documents. The ledger entry is strong, but it's hearsay until we can get the Helena filing and compare the 2 versions. The loan documents are strong, but a good lawyer for Evelyn could argue they were filing errors, not fraud. We need them both, and we need at least 3 witnesses willing to testify." He was talking now the way he worked methodically, without wasted motion. "How many of the ranch workers have been here long enough to know what the operation looked like under your father?" 2, Clara said. "Pete Harding, who runs the South Pasture. And an older man named Silas who tends the horses. The others Evelyn hired herself in the last 3 years. Are they afraid of her?" Clara thought about Pete Harding, who looked at the ground whenever Evelyn spoke and had once, 2 years ago, brought her a bowl of soup when she was sick, left it outside her door without knocking, and disappeared before she could thank him. She thought about Silas, who was 64 years old and had worked for her father since before she was born and had never once, in 4 years, made a comment about the way things had changed, but who also, she had noticed, kept his own ledger of the horse count in a small notebook in his coat pocket and updated it every week. "They're afraid," she said, "but they know. They've always known." Cole nodded. He said, "Afraid is fine. Willing to tell the truth when there's someone to tell it to, that's all we need." She thought about saying something else, something that had been sitting in her chest since the night before, taking up a quiet, complicated space. She thought about saying, "I don't know how to do this." I don't know how to trust something enough to put my whole future in it." She thought about saying, "The last time I believed something was going to be all right, my father was still alive." She didn't say any of it. She said, "I'll talk to Silas." "Good," Cole said. "I'll be at the boarding house tonight if you need to reach me." She nodded and walked back to her horse. She was halfway to the ranch house before she realized she was breathing easier than she had in a week, and that this was an entirely new and somewhat alarming development. Evelyn escalated on a Sunday. It was the timing that caught Clara off guard. Because Sundays had always been the quietest days, Evelyn went to church in the morning and came back in a particular composed, performed state that usually lasted until mid-afternoon. And that window was the closest thing to safe that the ranch offered. But this particular Sunday, Evelyn came back from church early, and she came back with company. Two men. Clara didn't know them. They weren't from Willow Creek. They came in a carriage that looked recently hired, and they had a particular kind of neutral, professional manner that she had learned to be very wary of, because it usually meant lawyers. She was in the kitchen when she heard the carriage arrive, and she moved to where she could hear without being visible, which was a skill so deeply bred in her muscle memory by now that she didn't think about it. Just did it, the way you don't think about breathing. "This is the property," Evelyn was saying, in the tone she used for professional contexts. "Everything in the Eastern Valley section, running to the ridge. My late husband's estate, as I've described." One of the men said something Clara couldn't catch. "Yes, the daughter is still in residence," Evelyn said. "That's a short-term situation. The estate management period concludes in 11 months, and at that point the daughter has indicated she intends to sell." Clara's hand tightened on the doorframe. She had never indicated anything of the kind. She had never said a word to anyone about selling. Not to Evelyn, not to anyone, which meant Evelyn was telling these men something that was simply untrue, and telling it in the calm, confident tone of someone who did not expect to be contradicted. Because the person who might contradict her was in the kitchen, invisible, where she had been put. "And the offer you mentioned," one of the men said, coming closer to the window now, his voice clearer. "Is that a firm number?" "Quite firm," Evelyn said. "I've consulted with legal counsel. The estate management arrangement gives me authority over any sale transactions during the active period. If we can come to an agreement before the management period concludes, the daughter's consent would be a tiny pause, so brief that if you weren't listening for it, you'd miss it entirely. A formality." A formality. Clara stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at the middle distance and understood exactly what she was hearing. Evelyn was not going to wait for the management period to end. She was going to try to sell the land before it did. And she had apparently convinced herself that she could convince a court, that Clara's consent was legally irrelevant. Which it was not. It was absolutely not. Clara knew estate law well enough to know that any sale of the primary property required the beneficiary's consent regardless of management arrangements. But knowing it and being able to prove it in court were two different things, and proving it required the original will, and the original will had been altered, and the alteration was in a filing in Helena. And it had been 14 months and nobody had thought to question it, because nobody had known to look. She walked out the back door, quietly, across the yard. To the stable. Silas was there tending to the horses. He looked up when she came in. He was 64, and weathered and had worked this land since before she was born, and he looked at her face and set down the brush he was holding without a word. "Silas," she said. She was proud of how steady her voice was. "She's meeting with buyers right now. Outside." Silas was quiet for a moment. Then he said very carefully, "How far along?" "Far enough that they're talking numbers." He looked at her. He had eyes the color of creek water in November, pale and clear and very tired. "Your daddy," he said, and stopped. "I know," Clara said. "I know what he would have wanted. But I need to know what you know. Not what you think. What you can say for certain, under oath if it comes to that." Another silence. She could hear the horses shifting, the sounds of the stable, that had been the background of her whole childhood. Then Silas reached into the inside pocket of his coat and pulled out a small notebook, the same one she'd seen him update every week for 3 years, and he held it out to her. "Every week," he said, "since she came. Every head count, every transaction I personally witnessed, every time I saw the ledger numbers posted and they didn't match what I'd seen with my own eyes. Your daddy taught me to keep records too." A pause. Seemed like a thing worth continuing. Clara took the notebook. She looked at him. "Why didn't you?" "'Cause I'm a 64-year-old horse tender with no land and no legal standing, and she would have had me run out of this county in a week." He said it matter-of-factly, without bitterness. "And because there wasn't anyone to take it to until..." He stopped. "Until what?" "Until that fella Maddox started asking the kind of questions that suggested somebody was finally building something." He looked at her steadily. "I've been waiting for you to come to me, miss. Didn't figure it was my place to come to you first." Clara held the notebook against her chest and did not say what was happening in her throat, which was something that had been building for 4 years and was very close to becoming ungovernable. She breathed through it. "Can you come to Cole Maddox tonight? At the boarding house?" "Yes, ma'am," Silas said. "I believe I can manage that." She walked back toward the house, past the side yard where Evelyn was still talking to the buyers in her smooth, professional voice, and Clara kept her head down and her expression blank. And she was so perfectly what Evelyn expected her to be: quiet, invisible, compliant, that neither Evelyn nor the two men paid her the slightest attention as she walked by. She was getting very good at being underestimated. The meeting at the boarding house that night was small. Clara arrived after dark, which felt reckless but was actually necessary. She could not be seen entering Cole's boarding house in daylight, not in a town where Evelyn had eyes in every window. She came around the back, through the kitchen, where the landlady, Mrs. Garrett, let her in without comment, because Mrs. Garrett had known Clara since she was 7 years old and had been watching what happened to her for 4 years, with the particular expression of a woman who knew something was wrong and had believed, until recently, that there was nothing to be done about it. Cole was there. Silas was there, sitting in the corner with his hat in his hands, looking at the floor with the concentrated expression of a man preparing himself for something. And there was one more person, a woman named Ruth Hennessy, 40-something, broad-shouldered, with the steady eyes of someone who had made a decision and intended to stand by it. "I brought Mrs. Hennessy," Cole said. "She wanted to come herself." "My husband wanted to come," Ruth said, looking at Clara directly. "I told him I would do it. It's too angry. Angry men make poor witnesses." She paused. "Our interest rate on the loan document registered at the county office is 9%. We signed a document that says 4. I have our copy at home in the tin box where we keep the deed. And I will say so in front of any judge in any court in this territory, because I have been paying more than I agreed to pay for 2 years, and I would like it to stop." Clara looked at her. "She could come after you for it." "Let her try," Ruth Hennessy said. "I have 6 children and a failing crop season and nothing left to be afraid of losing." She said it completely calmly. "I suspect that's the same math you're running, Miss Whitmore." Clara thought about it. Something like that. Cole spread the papers he had on the table. The documents he'd been collecting. The copies he'd requested through official channels. The records he'd found in the county association files. "Here's where we are," he said, and he walked them through it, the way Clara had walked through her father's ledgers, when she was 12, carefully, step by step, no wasted words. The altered loan documents, the Helena lawyer filing. The hidden ledger entry, the cattle count discrepancy. And now Silas's notebook, which Cole picked up and went through page by page with the expression of a man reading something he had hoped to find, and is both relieved and deeply troubled to have found. "This," Cole said, setting the notebook down, "is the most important piece of evidence we have, that we didn't have this morning. Silas, do you understand what I mean when I say you may be called to testify?" Silas looked up. "Yes, sir, I'm old, not ignorant." "All right." Cole almost smiled. "I'm writing to the territorial court in Helena tomorrow about the will. That takes time, but it's the load-bearing wall of all of this. Everything else is evidence of fraud, which matters. But if we can prove the will was altered, the whole structure of Evelyn Harper's legal authority collapses. And in the meantime, Clara said, in the meantime she tries to sell the land. The room was quiet. Ruth Hennessy looked at her hands. Silas looked at his hat. The lantern on the table made small movements of light across all of their faces. There's something I can do, Clara said. Everyone looked at her. She needs my signature. Or she believes she doesn't need it, because she thinks she's altered the will to give herself that authority. But the standard process for a land sale of this size requires the signature of the beneficiary on the title transfer. It's the process, not just the will, it's how the territorial recorder's office handles it. If I refuse to sign, the sale cannot complete, not legally. She'll find a way around it, Cole said. Maybe, but it buys time. Clara looked at him. How long do you need? 3 weeks, maybe 4. Then I'll stall for 4 weeks, Clara. He said her name in that direct, grounded way. She's not going to accept stalling passively. If she's meeting with buyers, she's already in a hurry. She's going to push, I know. She might do something that puts you in a difficult position. I know that too. Clara looked at him. But I've been in a difficult position for 4 years, and I'm still here. I know how to handle pressure. What I've never had is something to hold on to while I'm handling it. She looked around the table, Ruth Hennessy with her steady eyes, Silas with his notebook, Cole with his papers and his careful, measured certainty. Now I do. Ruth Hennessy made a small sound that might have been agreement or might have been emotion, quietly managed. Silas nodded once, slowly, like a man completing a long thought. Cole looked at her for a moment. Then he gathered the papers into a neat stack and set them on the side table. Tomorrow morning, he said, I need you to do one thing. Don't let her know anything has changed. Be exactly what she expects you to be. I've been practicing that for 4 years, Clara said. I know, but tonight you know why you're doing it. His eyes held hers. That's different. She walked home through the dark, and the sky was enormous and clear above her, the kind of sky that reminds you of scale, of how much exists beyond the edges of what you can see. And she thought about her father, who had loved this land and trusted the wrong person, and died not knowing what that trust would cost his daughter. She thought about what she was going to do with this land when it was hers again, not if, when she was done with if, and the thinking of it had a different quality than it used to. Used to be that imagining the future felt like standing at the edge of something, and not knowing whether the ground continued. Tonight it felt more like looking at a map, marked routes, known distances, the particular confidence of someone who has begun. Evelyn moved faster than Clara anticipated. The following Thursday, not 4 weeks later, not even 2, just 6 days after the meeting at the boarding house, Clara came downstairs at 6 in the morning and found a man she had never seen before sitting at the kitchen table with a leather folder in front of him, and Evelyn standing beside him with a cup of tea in her hand and an expression of perfect practiced reasonableness. Good morning, Clara, Evelyn said. This is Mr. Alcott. He's a legal representative. He has some documents he'd like to go over with you. Mr. Alcott stood. He was 50-ish, well-dressed, with the manner of a man who worked hard to appear neutral and mostly succeeded. Miss Whitmore, please sit down. This won't take long. Clara did not sit. She stood in the doorway and looked at Mr. Alcott and then at Evelyn and then back at Mr. Alcott. What kind of documents? Title transfer documents, Evelyn said before Alcott could answer. For the Eastern Valley section. It's a conditional sale. Clara, it doesn't affect the house or the home pasture. Just the eastern section and the ridge timber rights, which we agreed wouldn't be put into full production until you were older, anyway. We had not agreed to anything. They had never agreed to anything. Evelyn had never asked Clara's agreement on any matter since the month her father died. I'd like to see the documents, Clara said. Mr. Alcott opened the folder. She walked to the table. She did not sit. She stood and read, which she had found over the years was always the better choice, because it kept her mobile, kept her options open, kept the power of the position slightly in her favor, because she was looking down at the papers and therefore not in a position of having to look up at anyone. She read slowly. She understood everything she was reading, because she had grown up with legal documents, had watched her father review contracts since she was small, had spent 4 years reading every document she could access in this house. And what she was reading was not technically wrong. Not obviously fraudulent. The documents were professionally drafted and legally structured, and on the surface appeared to represent a conditional sale of approximately a third of the Whitmore land. But the beneficiary signature line read, Guardian or Legal Estate Representative. Not beneficiary, not Clara Whitmore, rightful heir. Guardian, this signature line, Clara said. This doesn't require my signature. Given the estate management arrangement, my authority covers this category of transaction, Evelyn said smoothly. I don't believe it does, Clara said, not for primary agricultural land. Evelyn's expression did not change in any significant way. But something shifted behind her eyes, the tiniest contraction. A recalculation. The will specifies. I'd like to review the will myself before any signature is offered, Clara said. The full current legal copy. I believe I'm entitled to request that. Silence. Mr. Alcott looked at his folder. He had the air of a man who had been briefed on how this conversation would go and was finding that it was not going that way, and who was not entirely sure whose problem that was. That can be arranged, he said carefully, in due time. But the offer has a deadline. Then the offer will need to wait until I've reviewed the will, Clara said. She looked at Evelyn directly. It was the first time she had looked at her fully, eye to eye, without flinching or calculating the cost, in longer than she could remember. I'm sure that's not a problem, since you've always told me that everything you've done has been entirely proper and above reproach. Evelyn looked back at her, and in Evelyn's eyes, in the space of 3 full seconds, Clara watched something happen. Not fear, not yet. Something that lived in the neighborhood of fear. The first small recognition that the person she had been managing for 4 years had stopped being manageable. Of course, Evelyn said. Her voice was smooth. It gave nothing away. We'll be in touch, Mr. Alcott. Mr. Alcott gathered his folder with obvious relief and left. Evelyn set down her teacup. She straightened one edge of the tablecloth with a single precise movement. She looked at Clara. You've been talking to someone, she said. It was not a question. It was a statement delivered in the tone of someone confirming a thing they already knew. Clara held her gaze and said nothing. Nothing was the right answer here. Nothing and stillness and the same blank, careful expression she had been wearing for 4 years, except that it felt, for the first time, like armor rather than defeat. Evelyn left the room. Clara stood at the kitchen table and counted to 10. Then she went to find Pete Harding, who was the other ranch hand she had told Cole to approach, and who was, she discovered, already waiting for her at the south fence gate, with an expression on his face that she had never seen there before. It was the expression of a man who had made up his mind. I talked to the Maddox fellow, Pete said. 3 nights back, he was looking at the fence post, not at her, but his voice was steady. I seen things, Miss Clara, since your stepmother took over. Things that ain't right, and that I should have said something about a long time ago and didn't, because I needed the work and I was scared, and I'm sorry for that. I'm sorry for that, truly. He looked at her then, but I'm not scared anymore. I don't know what it is about that fella Maddox, but he talked to me for an hour, and by the end of it I felt like if I didn't say something I would be the thing I hate most. He paused. I'm ready to say what I know, whenever and to whoever needs to hear it. Clara looked at Pete Harding, who had worked this land for 12 years, who had brought her soup when she was sick, who had looked at the ground whenever Evelyn spoke, who was now standing at the south fence gate in the early morning light with his jaw set and his hands steady. Thank you, she said, and then, because she had not said it enough in her life, to enough people, she said it again. Thank you, Pete. He nodded, turned back to his work. She turned back toward the house, 6 days in, 4 weeks to hold. She thought she could do it. She was not sure, but she thought so. Behind the house, somewhere in the direction of the ridge, a hawk called once, high and clear, and was answered by nothing, and then there was just the sound of the land going on as it had always gone on. patient and indifferent and completely unchanged, the small, urgent, consequential things that human beings did upon it. Clara walked back toward the house. She did not look at the ground. The letter from Helena arrived on a Wednesday. Cole had not told Clara he was expecting it. That particular day he hadn't known himself, had only known it was coming sometime in the next week, but somehow she was at the boarding house within an hour of its arrival, as if she had developed, over the past 3 weeks, some instinct for when something shifted in the machinery of what they were building together. She came through the back kitchen the way she always did, and Mrs. Garrett let her in without a word and gestured toward the hallway. And Clara found Cole at the small writing desk in the front room with a single folded document open in front of him and an expression on his face that she had learned to read well enough to know that what he had found was significant. She didn't ask. She just came and stood beside him and read. It took her 4 minutes to read the full document. Cole watched her face while she read it, because he had already read it twice, and what he needed now was to watch someone who knew this estate and this family and this history encounter what it said and react to it with their whole unguarded self. Clara's face did not change for the first 2 minutes. Something happened around her eyes, a tightening. The kind of expression that happens when a person confirms something they knew was true, but had been hoping, in the smallest possible interior corner of themselves, was not. She set the document down. "He left it to me outright," she said. Her voice was very quiet and very flat, no management period. No executor, no transitional arrangement. He left it directly to me, with immediate ownership upon his death. Yes, Cole said. She had it changed within 4 months of his funeral. The filing date on the amended document is 4 months and 11 days after Douglas Whitmore's recorded death. Clara was silent. She put one hand on the edge of the desk and stood there for a moment. Cole did not say anything, because there was nothing to say that was more important than giving her the space to hold what she was holding. He had known men who rushed into silence like this with comfort or analysis or practical next steps, and he had always thought they were afraid of the silence itself, which was a kind of selfishness dressed up as helpfulness. He wasn't afraid of her silence. He waited. 4 years, she finally said. Yes, 4 years of everything she did to me, the accounts, the restrictions, the humiliations, the threats, all of it was built on a document that should never have existed. That's correct. She turned and looked at him. Her eyes were dry, which he suspected was costing her something considerable. What do we do with this? This document, combined with the original filed copy that my contact in the territorial office has now flagged as potentially fraudulent, is enough to initiate a formal challenge. Not a county court challenge, those can be manipulated, and Evelyn has relationships there. A territorial court filing. Federal jurisdiction, if we can establish that the fraud crossed county lines, which it did, because the alteration was filed in a different county. How long to file? I can have the paperwork drafted in 3 days. To get a hearing? Possibly 4 to 6 weeks. Clara absorbed this. He could see her doing the arithmetic, the same way she did every calculation, quickly, quietly, with no visible working, just the conclusion arriving on her face. The land sale, she said. Mr. Alcott hasn't come back, but he will. She'll push again. She'll push harder now, Cole said. Because she's in a hurry, and she can feel that something has changed in you, even if she doesn't know exactly what. She knows something, Clara said. She knows I'm not what I was 3 weeks ago. She paused. She locked the estate office yesterday, put a new padlock on it. I noticed this morning, Cole was still the hidden ledger. She moved it, or destroyed it. Clara said it with the steady evenness of someone who had already processed this loss and come out the other side. I expected it. I wrote everything down from memory the night I found it. It's not as strong as the physical document, but it's corroboration. And we don't need it as much now. She nodded at the letter from Helena. We have this, Cole agreed, and we have Silas's notebook. And Ruth Hennessy's loan document. And the Garza family, I spoke to them yesterday. They have their original copy, and their rate is 4% too. The county registered version is 8%. They're willing to testify. That's 3 families, Clara said. 4 if the Beaumont widow agrees. I'm seeing her this afternoon, Clara nodded slowly. She looked back at the document on the desk. There's something else, she said. Something in her voice made Cole straighten. She used that tone, careful, deliberate, the tone of someone selecting words the way you select footing on uncertain ground, only when she was about to say something that cost her. There's a man, she said. He was at supper twice last month. Name is Garrett Spence. He manages property investments out of Billings. I overheard Evelyn speaking with him at the church social, not a real conversation. Just pieces, but the pieces were about a buyer. A corporate buyer, not a local rancher, a land company. Cole absorbed this. A land company changes things. A land company has lawyers, Clara said. Real ones. Billings or Helena lawyers, not county courthouse lawyers. If Evelyn completes a sale to a land company before our court filing is established, the company becomes a third party in the transaction. An innocent purchaser. And then even if the court invalidates Evelyn's authority, the sale might stand because the buyer had no knowledge of the fraud. Yes, she looked at him. I don't know how close she is to completing it. But if Garrett Spence is involved, it's further along than I thought. Cole sat back in his chair. He looked at the ceiling for a moment, which was how he thought he had noticed this herself, the upward look that meant he was working through something at speed. Then he looked back at her. We don't have 4 to 6 weeks, he said. We need to file within the next 10 days. Can you do that? The territorial court filing, yes, that I can do. He paused. The harder part is getting an emergency injunction against the land sale. To block it while the case is heard. That requires a judge to review our evidence and agree there's sufficient grounds to freeze the transaction. That process is, he stopped. Complicated, Clara finished. And expensive. And it requires a territorial judge to be convinced in a short amount of time that a woman with significant local standing and no prior legal record has committed deliberate estate fraud. He said it plainly, without apology. It's not impossible, but it requires everything we have to be airtight. Then we make it airtight, Clara said. She said it with the same quiet certainty that she brought to everything, the certainty of someone who had been doing careful, invisible work for 4 years and was finally turning it toward a single point. Cole looked at her and thought not for the first time, but more clearly than before that whatever Evelyn Harper had intended to do by trapping Clara Whitmore in 4 years of powerlessness, what she had actually done was build a woman who knew exactly how this kind of system worked, knew its pressure points and its vulnerabilities, and had spent 4 years of enforced silence cataloging all of it. She was the most dangerous thing in this county. She just hadn't been in a position to use it yet. All right, he said. Sit down, we have a lot of work to do. She sat down. They worked for 4 hours without stopping. 3 days later, Evelyn summoned Clara to the parlor. This in itself was unusual. Evelyn did not summon. She directed, she managed, she arranged. Summoning implied a formality that she typically avoided, because formality created a record of a relationship, and she preferred interactions that left no trace. So when the housekeeper, a woman named Mrs. Dunbar, who had worked in the ranch house for 6 years, and who Clara suspected was at least partly in Evelyn's confidence, came to the kitchen and said that Mrs. Harper requested Miss Clara in the parlor at her convenience, which meant immediately Clara knew something had shifted. She took a moment, washed her hands, dried them, stood at the kitchen window, and looked out at the south pasture where Pete Harding was working the fence line, and thought, this is what it looks like from the outside. This ordinary morning, this ordinary ranch. And thought, hold on. Then she went to the parlor. Evelyn was not alone. A man Clara didn't recognize was standing near the fireplace. 60 years old, perhaps, with the bearing of a man who had spent decades in rooms where things were decided. Not a lawyer, he didn't have the lawyer's particular neutral armor. Something else, something administrative. Clara cataloged this in the first 2 seconds. Clara, Evelyn said, this is Mr. Horace Fleming. He's the county property assessor. Clara looked at Fleming. He looked back at her with a professional pleasantness that told her nothing about what he knew or which direction he was pointing. Miss Whitmore, Mr. Fleming has been reviewing the estate's property classification, Evelyn said, and her voice had a particular smoothness to it that Clara had learned, through 4 years of close and involuntary study, was the sound of someone who believed they held all the cards. There's a matter of the Eastern Valley section's recorded acreage that needs to be formally assessed before any transactions can proceed. A standard procedure. It was not a standard procedure. Clara knew enough about property law to know that a mid-cycle assessment by the county assessor required either a dispute filing or a request from the estate manager. Evelyn had requested this. The question was why and what it achieved. She thought about it quickly. If the acreage was reassessed and recorded differently, the property boundaries could shift on paper. Shifting boundaries affected which parcels were classified as primary agricultural land, which affected whether Clara's signature was required on a sale. It was elegant in a cold sort of way. Evelyn was trying to reclassify the land to remove the signature requirement. "I'd like to be present for the assessment," Clara said. "That won't be necessary," Evelyn said. "You're not the estate manager." "I'm the beneficiary of the estate," Clara said. "I believe I'm entitled to be present for any official assessment of the property." Fleming shifted slightly. He looked from Clara to Evelyn and back to Clara, and she could see him recalibrating something. He was, she thought, a man who liked to operate in situations with clear authority structures, and this one had just become less clear. "It's a standard review," he said carefully. "No formal objection process is triggered by—" "I'm not objecting," Clara said pleasantly. "I'm simply requesting to be present." "As the named beneficiary in the estate documents, is that a legal impediment to the assessment?" Fleming opened his mouth and then closed it. "No," he said. "I don't believe it is." Evelyn's expression did not change, but the air in the room changed, in the way it changes when a person who expected to walk through an open door walks into a closed one instead. "Very well," she said. "The assessment is Friday, 9 o'clock. "I'll be ready," Clara said. She left the parlor, walked through the kitchen, out the back door, across the yard to the stable, and into the tack room, and sat down on an upturned crate and breathed very carefully for 30 seconds. Then she got up and went to find Silas. She needed to get a message to Cole before nightfall. Cole's response came back within 2 hours via Silas, who had apparently developed a facility for moving around Willow Creek without being particularly noticed, which Cole had identified early as a significant operational advantage. The message was 3 sentences. Assessment is the reclassification play. File the injunction Friday morning before 9. I'll be at the courthouse when it opens. Clara read it twice, folded it into her pocket, and stood for a moment with her hand over the folded paper, feeling the particular quality of this moment, which was the quality of a thing that has been building for a long time and is now very close to the point where it either holds or breaks. Thursday night was long. She did not sleep, but this time the sleeplessness had a different character, not the hollow, grinding insomnia of fear, but the alert, taut wakefulness of someone who is about to do something that cannot be undone and is making very sure they are ready. She went through everything in her head. The document from Helena, Silas's notebook, Ruth Hennessy's loan copy, the Garza family's copy, the numbers she had memorized from the hidden ledger, Pete Harding's testimony about the cattle he had personally counted and the figures he had personally seen reported differently. Every piece of it in order in the logical sequence that would present the cleanest picture of what had been done over 4 years to one girl on one ranch in one Montana valley. She got up before light and dressed and sat on the edge of her bed and thought about her father. She thought, "I know what you wrote. I know what you intended. I'm sorry it took this long." And then she stood up and went downstairs and made herself eat something, because her father had also taught her that you do not go into difficult work on an empty stomach, and some lessons are practical enough to apply in any circumstance. Cole was at the courthouse when it opened at 8 o'clock Friday morning. Clara did not go with him. This was intentional, and they had discussed it specifically. Her absence from the courthouse filing would mean that when 9 o'clock arrived and she appeared for the property assessment, Evelyn would have no warning that anything had changed. That gap between the filing of the injunction and Evelyn becoming aware of it was the gap they needed. She dressed carefully that Friday morning. Not differently. Exactly the same as any other day. The same plain dress, the same pinned hair, the same downcast expression she used as camouflage. She went to breakfast, she ate, she helped Mrs. Dunbar clear the plates. She was so precisely, perfectly ordinary that she was almost proud of herself. At 8:55 she walked to the parlor. Evelyn was already there with Mr. Fleming, who had arrived early and was setting up his papers on the side table. 2 additional men were with him, surveyors, by the look of their equipment. And there was also, she noticed, a man she had not expected. Garrett Spence. He was standing near the window, and he looked at her when she entered with the neutral expression of a man who has been thoroughly briefed on a situation and believes he understands it completely. Clara looked at him for precisely 1 second, long enough to understand that the land company offer was further along than she had thought, that Evelyn had invited the buyer's representative to witness the assessment. That this meeting was intended to conclude with the assessment, the reclassification, and probably a signed letter of intent for the sale, all in one morning, neat and done before anyone could interfere. It was, she had to admit, very well organized. She sat down. She folded her hands in her lap. She waited. At exactly 9 o'clock, the parlor door opened and a man she did not know walked in, followed by Cole Maddox. The man was dressed in a territorial court clerk's uniform. He was carrying a sealed official document. He looked around the room, identified Evelyn Harper by the position of authority she occupied, and addressed her with the precise, impersonal courtesy of someone performing an official function. Mrs. Evelyn looked at him, then at Cole. And in that moment, in the exact second when her eyes moved from the court clerk to Cole Maddox standing behind him, Clara saw it. The thing she had been waiting 4 years to see. Not guilt, not fear exactly, but the recognition. The recognition that the ground she had believed was solid was not solid, and that she had made a miscalculation. And that the miscalculation was standing in her parlor at 9 o'clock in the morning, in the form of a man who had ridden into town 6 weeks ago on a gray horse with a folded land notice in his pocket. "I have an emergency injunction filed in the Territorial Court of Montana this morning," the clerk said. "It pertains to the sale, transfer, assessment, or reclassification of any property currently recorded under the Whitmore estate." He held out the sealed document. "All transactions pertaining to said property are hereby frozen, pending a scheduled court hearing on the question of estate document fraud." Nobody in the room spoke. Mr. Fleming looked at his papers, and then at the sealed document, and then at the ceiling. The surveyors looked at each other. Garrett Spence looked at the sealed document with the expression of a man recalculating a very large number. Evelyn looked at Clara. Clara looked back at her. She did not look away. "You," Evelyn said. It came out quieter than Clara expected, which was almost worse than if she had shouted. "You did this." "Yes," Clara said. "You ungrateful." Evelyn stopped. Visibly stopped herself. The effort of it was visible in her jaw, in the precise set of her shoulders, in the particular stillness of someone who knows that anything they say in this room, in front of these witnesses, is now part of the record. "You have no idea what you've done." "I think I do," Clara said. She did not say it with triumph. She had thought she might feel triumph, had wondered in her sleepless hours what that would feel like. But what she actually felt, sitting in that chair in the parlor of the house she had grown up in, looking at the woman who had stolen 4 years of her life and her father's intentions and the future he had meant to give her, was something quieter than triumph. Something closer to clarity. The feeling of finally being in the correct position after years of being forced into the wrong one. "Mrs. Harper," the clerk said, "you will receive notice of the court date within the week. In the meantime, the injunction is binding. Any attempt to proceed with property transactions in violation." "I understand what an injunction means," Evelyn said. Her voice had moved fully into control mode, all the edges smooth again, the way it always did when she was managing something. She looked at Garrett Spence. "I apologize for this complication. My legal representatives will be in contact." Spence looked at her for a long moment. Then he picked up his hat from the side table. "With respect, Mrs. Harper," he said, "a fraud claim in a territorial court is not a complication I can present to our investors. We'll need to reconsider the timeline." He looked at the sealed document one more time. Then he left. In the silence after the front door closed, Evelyn turned back to Clara. "You think this helps you," she said. Very quiet, very controlled. "A court case draws attention, Clara. It draws attention to a lot of things." "I'm counting on it," Clara said. Something flickered in Evelyn's eyes. The recalculation happened very fast, and Clara watched it and thought, she's going to chop something else. She doesn't have the land sale anymore, and she knows it. She's going to pivot. She's been doing this for 4 years, and she doesn't know how to stop. She was right. It came that same afternoon. Clara was in the kitchen when Mrs. Dunbar found her, and Mrs. Dunbar's face had the particular uncomfortable expression of a woman who has been asked to deliver a message she does not want to deliver. "Mrs. Harper has asked me to tell you," she said, not quite meeting Clara's eyes, "that she has notified the county sheriff that certain items have gone missing from the locked estate office, and that she believes—" Clara went very still. "She believes you may have taken them." The missing items were, of course, the hidden ledger, which Evelyn herself had moved or destroyed, which Clara had not touched since the one night she'd found and memorized it. But which, if the sheriff came and searched Clara's room and found the Bible with the entries written on the inside back cover. She moved before she had finished the thought. She walked out of the kitchen and up the back stairs to her room, not fast enough to appear urgent, exactly the same pace she always used, and she lifted the Bible from the shelf and stood with it for a moment. She could not go to Cole. Going to Cole now, right after the injunction, right as Evelyn had filed with the sheriff, would look like exactly what it was. She needed somewhere else, somewhere the sheriff wouldn't look and Evelyn couldn't reach. She thought about Mrs. Garrett, the boarding house landlady who had let her in through the kitchen without comment for 6 weeks. She thought about Ruth Hennessy, who had 6 children and a tin box and nothing left to be afraid of. She thought about Silas. She thought about her father, who had given a Bible to a 16-year-old girl at the worst moment of her life, who had written on the inside front cover, in his careful, methodical hand, "For my Clara, the truth is always worth knowing, even when it costs you." She opened the Bible to the inside front cover and read that inscription for the first time in 2 years. Stood with it for a full 10 seconds. Then she put the Bible inside her coat and walked downstairs and out the back door and across the yard, and she went to Silas's small quarters above the stable, and she knocked. And when he opened the door, she held out the Bible without explaining and said, "Keep this. Don't tell anyone you have it unless I ask you to, or unless something happens to me." Silas looked at her face. He did not ask questions. He took the Bible and put it inside his coat, just as she had done, and nodded once. "Nothing's going to happen to you," he said. "I know," she said. "But just in case." She was crossing back to the main house when the sheriff's deputy arrived at the front gate. She saw him from across the yard, young, uncomfortable, clearly not enjoying his assignment. He spotted her and headed toward her instead of the house, which was either a good sign or a very bad one. "Miss Whitmore," he said, "I have a complaint to follow up on." "From Mrs. Harper." "I know," Clara said. "You can search my room. I don't have anything that belongs to the estate office, and I never have." He blinked. He had clearly expected more resistance. "Ah, yes, ma'am. Thank you for your cooperation." She walked him through the house, up to her room. She stood in the doorway while he looked thoroughly and professionally through every drawer and shelf and corner. He found nothing because there was nothing to find. The inside back cover of her Bible, where the entries were written, was currently in Silas's coat pocket above the stable. When the deputy was finished, he stood in the center of her room with the uncomfortable expression of a man who had been sent to find something and was going to have to go back and report he hadn't found it. "I'm sorry for the inconvenience," he said. "No inconvenience," Clara said. "Deputy, I want to tell you something. The estate is currently under a territorial court injunction regarding fraud proceedings." Any action taken by Mrs. Harper against my person or my property during the period of that injunction may be considered retaliation against a court witness. I'm not a lawyer, and I may have some details of the law wrong, but I believe that's approximately correct." The deputy looked at her. He was young but not unintelligent. She watched him work through the implications, and she watched the moment when he understood that the situation he had walked into was considerably more complicated than the one he'd been told he was walking into. "I'll note that in my report," he said. "Thank you," Clara said. "I appreciate it." He left. She stood at her bedroom window and watched him go, and then she watched Evelyn come out of the front door and speak to him at the gate, and she watched Evelyn's posture change as he delivered whatever he reported to her. And she watched Evelyn come back toward the house, with a controlled, deliberate walk that Clara knew, from 4 years of close observation, was the walk of someone who was furious and concealing it. The thing about watching someone for 4 years, Clara thought, was that you learned every variation. You learned the fine-grained difference between content anger and genuine uncertainty. You learned which movements meant planning and which meant reaction. You learned to read a person so thoroughly that their face became almost transparent, all the mechanisms visible underneath. Evelyn was scared, not completely, not yet. She was still organizing, still calculating, still looking for the angle that would restore her position. But underneath all of it, for the first time in 4 years, there was fear. Clara could see it as clearly as she could see anything. She turned from the window. Cole would be at the boarding house tonight. She needed to tell him about the sheriff, about the Bible, about the deputy's visit. She needed to tell him what she had seen in Evelyn's face when she came back from the gate. She needed to tell him, also, though this part was harder, required a different kind of courage than everything else, that she had looked out the window tonight and realized that she was no longer counting days. She had stopped, without noticing exactly when, measuring time as the distance between now and 21, between now and freedom. She had stopped measuring time as suffering to be survived. She was measuring it now as a case being built, as something moving toward completion. As something that was, against every reasonable expectation she had been able to maintain for 4 years, going to be all right. That realization was almost more frightening than anything Evelyn had ever done to her. Because hope, she had discovered, was the most vulnerable thing she had ever attempted to carry. But she was carrying it. She straightened her spine, lifted her chin, and went downstairs to begin the work of getting through one more ordinary evening in a house that was, she was increasingly certain, not going to be Evelyn Harper's house for very much longer. The first crack appeared 6 days later. It came from an unexpected direction, not from the court proceedings, not from Evelyn's continued maneuvering, but from inside the house itself. Mrs. Dunbar came to Clara early on a Tuesday morning and asked if they might speak privately, and Clara looked at the woman's face and saw something she had never seen there before. The expression of someone who has been holding something a very long time, and has reached the limit of how long they can hold it. They sat in the kitchen, with the door closed. Mrs. Dunbar had her hands on the table, and she was looking at them, and she was silent for almost a full minute before she spoke. "I've worked in this house for 6 years," she said. "I came when your father was still alive. I know what this place was like then, and I know what it became." She stopped. "I've seen things, and I've said nothing, because I needed the work, and because Mrs. Harper, I was afraid of her, Miss Clara. I'm not ashamed to say it. I was afraid." Clara did not say anything. "But I've been watching you these past weeks, Mrs. Dunbar said, "and I've been watching Mr. Maddox, what little I can see of it. And there's something I need to tell you. Something I should have told someone a long time ago." She reached into her apron pocket and put a small folded paper on the table. 3 years ago," she said, "Mrs. Harper had a visitor. A man. He came in the evening through the back, and they met in the study. I heard part of what they said, because I was listening." She said this plainly, without apology. "The man's name was Cutter. He worked at the clerk's office in Beaverhead County. She paid him. Cash. I saw her count it out, and I saw him take it, and I saw what he left behind, because she dropped it and I found it under the desk the next morning when I was cleaning. She looked at Clara. It was a receipt for document amendment services. I kept it. I don't know why I kept it. I told myself it wasn't my business. But I kept it. She tapped the folded paper on the table. Clara looked at the folded paper. She picked it up and opened it. It was a small receipt, handwritten, the kind that a man creates when he is operating outside official channels but has enough bureaucratic instinct to want a record. It listed a fee, a service description amendment and refiling, estate document, Whitmore account, and at the bottom, 2 signatures. One was Evelyn Harper's, the other was a name Clara did not recognize. Cutter. Clara's hands were completely steady. She looked up at Mrs. Dunbar. Would you be willing to testify to this in court? Mrs. Dunbar looked back at her. She was 60 years old and had cooked in this kitchen for 6 years and had spent 3 of them carrying something she should have put down long before now. Yes, she said, I believe I would. Clara set the receipt down on the table between them. She thought about all the people who had known and stayed silent. She thought about the deputy, and Pete Harding, and Silas, and Ruth Hennessy, and now Mrs. Dunbar, and she thought about what it meant that all these people had been carrying pieces of this for years, separately, in isolation, each one convinced they were alone in what they knew. They had not been alone. They had simply never been given a reason to speak until now. Mrs. Dunbar, Clara said, I need you to come with me to the boarding house tonight. Is that possible? Yes, Mrs. Dunbar said, I believe it is. Clara folded the receipt carefully and put it in her pocket and stood up. She stood at the kitchen window for just a moment, looking out at the yard, at the south pasture where Pete Harding was working, at the stable where Silas kept his records and her Bible, and 64 years of careful attention to what was right. The case was airtight. It had just become airtight. And somewhere in the county courthouse, in 4 days' time, a territorial court judge was going to open a file that contained the original will, the amended version, a signed receipt for the amendment, 3 altered loan documents with their originals alongside them, a notebook with 4 years of independent cattle counts, and the testimony of 5 people who had been afraid to speak and had found, one by one, that they were afraid no longer. Clara turned from the window. She thought about Evelyn in the parlor that morning, watching Garrett Spence pick up his hat and leave. She thought about Evelyn's face at the gate when the deputy delivered his report. She thought about the particular expression of a person who has built a very large structure on a single point of foundation and is beginning finally to feel that foundation shift. 4 days. She could hold 4 more days. She went to find Silas to tell him about the receipt, and as she crossed the yard, she did not look at the ground, and she did not lower her head, and Pete Harding saw her from the south fence and raised his hand in a small, simple salute that she returned without breaking stride. It was not a large gesture, but it was real, and it was hers, and in a life that had contained very few things she could say that about, it mattered more than she could put into words. The 4 days did not pass quietly. Clara had expected that. She had told herself, going into it, that Evelyn would not simply wait. That a woman who had spent 4 years building and maintaining a system of control would not sit in her parlor and watch that system dismantle itself without doing something. The question had never been whether Evelyn would move. The question was which direction she would move from, and how fast, and whether Clara could see it coming in time to brace. The first thing Evelyn did was call her lawyer, not the Helena lawyer that connection was now burned, was in fact part of the court filing, his name on the amendment document that the territorial office had flagged. She called a man named Bertram Hull, out of Butte, and he arrived on the afternoon train the day after the injunction was served, and he was everything the county courthouse lawyers were not: polished, precise, and genuinely dangerous in the way that only very good lawyers can be dangerous, which is the way of someone who knows exactly where the edges of the law are and exactly how close you can walk to them. Clara learned about Hull through Pete Harding, who overheard his arrival discussed between Evelyn and Mrs. Dunbar in the front hallway and came straight to the stable to find Silas, who sent word to the boarding house within the hour. Cole sent back a single line, expected stay steady. She stayed steady. Hull's first move was to request a delay in the court date, arguing that the injunction had been filed without adequate notice to the estate representative and that the evidence cited was based on copies rather than originals. The territorial court clerk denied the delay. Cole had anticipated this argument and had included in the filing both the original Helena letter and a certified copy of the amendment document with the clerk's own authentication stamp, which made the copy's argument legally thin. Hull's second move was to file a counterclaim arguing that the injunction itself was improperly motivated, that it was part of a coordinated effort by a non-family third party, specifically Cole Maddox, to interfere in the estate management arrangement for personal financial gain. Cole was in the boarding house when he read the counterclaim. He read it twice, set it down, and sat quietly for a moment. Then he picked up his pen and began writing a response, and he did not stop writing until the lamp had burned low and the response was done. And it was 22 pages long and cited 14 territorial statutes and included a signed affidavit from his contact in the federal land office attesting to the authenticity of the Helena document. Clara read it the next morning. When she finished, she looked up at him. "You wrote all of this last night?" "Couldn't sleep anyway," he said. "Cole," she said his name the way he said hers directly, without preamble. "You didn't come here for this. You came for a piece of land and a quiet life. And instead you've spent 6 weeks building a legal case and writing 22 pages in the middle of the night. And Evelyn's lawyer is now claiming you're doing it for financial gain and your reputation in this county." "My reputation in this county is fine," he said. "Ask Mrs. Garrett. Ask the Hennessy family. Ask any of the people Evelyn Harper has been squeezing for 3 years who finally have someone in their corner." He looked at her steadily. "I'm not here because I have nothing else to do, Clara. I'm here because it's right, and I reckon you understand that argument because you've been making it yourself for 4 years without anyone backing you up." She was quiet for a moment. "Then the counterclaim names you specifically. If the court decides there's any merit." "The court won't," he said. "Because there isn't any. I haven't profited from a single thing I've done in this county. I haven't even bought the Callaway land yet." He paused. "I wanted to make sure you were settled before I did." She looked at him. He said it so plainly, with so little performance, that it took her a moment to understand the full weight of what he meant. He had delayed his own purpose, his own plans, the thing he had ridden 3 weeks to accomplish, because he had decided that her situation needed to be resolved first. Not because she had asked, not because there was anything in it for him. Because he had seen a girl sitting in the dirt on Main Street and decided, somewhere in his quiet, unhurried way, that she deserved to have someone on her side. She didn't know what to do with that. She filed it away in the same place she filed everything she didn't yet know how to process, which was the same place she had been filing things for 4 years, the interior space that was entirely hers, that Evelyn had never been able to reach. 2 more days, she said. 2 more days, he agreed. The second thing Evelyn did was talk to the preacher. Reverend Aldous Marsh had run the Willow Creek Church for 11 years and was, by any objective measure, a decent man operating in a position that required a very delicate balance between moral authority and social survival. He knew most of what went on in his congregation. He had his suspicions about several things, including the situation at the Whitmore Ranch. And he had managed those suspicions the way small-town clergymen often manage the discrepancy between what they know and what they can prove by praying about it and waiting for God to arrange a resolution. That didn't require him to do something uncomfortable. Evelyn went to see him on the second day after the injunction. Clara didn't know this until Reverend Marsh came to the ranch house the following morning and asked to speak with her privately, which was itself unusual enough to make her immediately cautious. She agreed. She sat with him in the small sitting room off the kitchen, where Evelyn never went because it had been her father's room, kept exactly as he'd left it. Reverend Marsh sat across from her with his hat in his hands, and his expression carrying the particular discomfort of a man who has been sent to say something he does not entirely believe. "Mrs. Harper came to me yesterday," he said. "She's concerned about the direction things have been moving. She asked me to speak with you about the importance of resolving family matters within the family, before they go further into the court system." Clara looked at him. Did she? She feels that a court proceeding will be damaging to the family name, to your father's memory. He paused. And she mentioned certain. She suggested that if the case proceeds, her lawyers may be obligated to introduce information about your behavior in recent weeks. About meetings at the boarding house. He stopped. He seemed genuinely uncomfortable. She framed it in terms of your reputation, Clara. As a young woman, she suggested that the nature of your relationship with Mr. Maddox, if examined publicly, could be what? Clara said. Her voice was very quiet. Marsh looked at his hat. Misrepresented, he said, unfavorably. Clara sat with this for a moment. She felt something cold move through her, and then, following immediately behind it, something that was not cold at all, something that was, after a moment of recognition, anger. Not the hot, ungovernable kind, the clear kind, the kind that does not need to shout because it knows exactly what it is. Reverend Marsh, she said, I want to make sure I understand what you're telling me. Evelyn Harper sent you to inform me that if I proceed with a fraud case against her, she will attempt to damage my reputation by implying an improper relationship with the man who has been helping me build that case. Marsh was quiet, and she sent a preacher to deliver this message, Clara continued, because she believed that would give it more weight. Or perhaps because she believed I would be more likely to yield to a moral authority than to a direct threat. She was wrong on both counts, Clara said. She said it without heat, completely even. My relationship with Mr. Maddox has been conducted in the presence of other witnesses at all times. Mrs. Garrett can attest to every meeting. Silas can attest to every meeting. Mrs. Dunbar, as of this week, can attest to specific meetings as well. Any attempt to misrepresent the nature of that relationship in court would require the testimony of a witness who was present, and every witness who was present will say the same thing. She paused. Please tell Mrs. Harper, I said, thank you for the warning. Marsh was looking at her with an expression she hadn't expected to see, something that lived between surprise, and she thought, a cautious respect. I'm sorry, he said. I should have refused to come. Yes, Clara said, you should have. But you came and you told me honestly what she said, and that's actually more useful than you might think. She looked at him. Reverend Marsh, the court date is in 2 days. When it's over, and when the truth about what's been done in this county comes out fully, and it will come out fully, Willow Creek is going to have to decide what kind of place it wants to be. The kind that knew what was happening and looked away. Or the kind that finally said something when it mattered. She stood. I hope you'll think about which side of that you want to be on. He left with his hat in his hands, his expression the expression of a man doing a reckoning that was long overdue. Clara stood at the sitting room window and watched him go, and she thought about all the moral authorities who had passed through her life in 4 years and found reasons not to intervene, and she thought that if she ever had children, she would teach them early that moral authority that does not act when it costs something is just another form of cowardice in better clothing. She went to find Cole. He was at the courthouse that afternoon, filing the response to Hull's counterclaim. She met him outside afterward, on the courthouse steps, which was a public enough location that nobody could misrepresent it, and she told him about Marsh's visit in precise detail. Cole listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was silent for a moment. Then, she's scared. I know. This is the kind of move you make when the ground is shifting and you're running out of options. He looked across the street at nothing in particular. Hull's going to try something in the courtroom. Something we haven't anticipated. That's what lawyers like him do. They build a case that looks airtight from one side, and then they find the one angle nobody was covering, and they come through it. What angle aren't we covering? He looked at her. The witnesses, he said. Ruth Hensey and her husband. The Garza family. Silas. Mrs. Dunbar. All of them have agreed to testify. But agreeing over a kitchen table is different from sitting in a courtroom chair while a Butte lawyer takes apart everything you've ever done or said. He paused. Hull is going to try to discredit them individually. Their debts, their histories, their relationships with each other and with you. He's going to try to make this look like a coordinated story rather than independent testimony. Clara thought about this. Is there anything we can do? We can make sure every one of them understands exactly what Hull is going to say to them. Not to prepare a performance that backfires, but so they're not caught off guard. Surprised witnesses make poor witnesses. He looked at her. Can you get them together tonight? All of them? She thought about the logistics. The risks, the visibility of getting 6 people to one location without Evelyn noticing. Mrs. Garrett's kitchen, she said, after 9. I'll talk to Silas. I'll bring the counterclaim filing so they can see exactly how Hull has framed his argument. She nodded. She started to go, then stopped Cole. He looked at her. When this is over, whatever happens in that courtroom, I want you to know that regardless of the outcome, what you've done the 6 weeks you've spent here, the 22 pages you wrote at midnight, the way you talked to Pete Harding for an hour until he decided he wasn't scared anymore, that mattered. It matters to me. She stopped, started again. I don't have a lot of practice saying things like that. But I wanted to say it before the courtroom, in case things get complicated and I forget to. Cole looked at her for a long moment. Things are going to go fine in that courtroom, he said. You don't know that. No, he agreed, but I know who built the case. And I know she's standing in front of me right now. And I've seen what she can do when she has a room to stand in and the truth on her side. He touched the brim of his hat. So I'm not particularly worried. She went to find Silas. The meeting at Mrs. Garrett's kitchen that night was different from the previous ones. Not in the evidence was the same, organized and thorough, and as airtight as 6 weeks of careful work could make it. But in the quality of the people around the table. Ruth Hennessy sat with her hands flat on the table and her jaw set, and she had brought her husband this time, who had calmed down from the fury she'd and settled into the particular quiet anger of a man who has decided he is going to be useful. The Garza family sent their eldest son, a man of about 30 named Marcos, who spoke carefully and listened to everything Cole said about Hull's likely approach, with the focused attention of someone filing each piece of information for immediate use. Silas had his notebook. Mrs. Dunbar had the receipt. Pete Harding had written out, at Cole's earlier suggestion, a detailed account of every cattle count discrepancy he had personally witnessed, which turned out to be 11 specific instances over 3 years, each with a date and a figure. Cole walked them through Hull's counterclaim argument. He read the relevant sections aloud, plainly, without dramatizing. He explained what Hull would likely ask each of them and why, and what the honest answer to each question was, and how to deliver an honest answer in a way that could not be twisted, which was, he said, simply to answer exactly what was asked and nothing more, and to say I don't know when you don't know, and to say that's not what I said if someone misrepresents your words, and to look at the judge rather than at Hull when you're doing it. He's going to try to make you feel like the problem is you, Cole said. Your debts, your reasons for being here, your relationship to Clara, your relationship to each other. He's going to try to make this look coordinated. What's your defense against that? Ruth Hennessy answered immediately, the truth. The truth isn't coordinated. The truth is just what happened, and what happened to each of us is a separate thing that will sound the same because it is the same. She looked around the table. None of us were in a room together before Mr. Maddox started asking questions. None of us knew the others had the same story. That's not coordination. That's just what she did, spread out across enough people that she thought none of them would ever compare notes. The room was quiet for a moment. That, Cole said, is exactly what you say if Hull calls it coordinated. Ruth Hennessy nodded once. She had Clara thought, the demeanor of someone who had been underestimated for most of her life and was preparing to be underestimated one final time. After the meeting ended and people filed out through Mrs. Garrett's back kitchen into the dark town, Clara sat at the cleared table for a moment while Cole organized his papers. She was thinking about the morning, about the courtroom she had passed in the courthouse but never entered, about the judge who would open the file and read 40 years of her father's work distilled into a fraud case. "Tell me something," she said. Cole looked up. "When you came to Willow Creek," she said. "When you first rode in, before you saw me in the street. What did you think it was going to be? This place? This life? What were you looking for?" He set his papers down. He thought about it, the way he thought about things that mattered, not rushing to fill the silence, but actually considering. "Quiet," he said finally. "I'd been moving for 3 years. After he started again, there were some things that went wrong. A business arrangement that turned into fraud, which I mentioned. A woman I intended to marry who decided she didn't want the life I was going to be able to offer after the fraud took most of what I had." He said this without bitterness, in the same matter-of-fact tone he used for everything. "I wanted somewhere to put down roots, a piece of land I could work and build on my own terms." Quiet. He looked at her. "I found something considerably less quiet." "I'm sorry," Clara said. "Don't be." He picked up his papers again. "Turns out quiet was the wrong thing to be looking for. Turns out I needed something worth doing." He glanced at her. "You should sleep. Tomorrow's going to be long." She went back to the ranch house, slipping in through the kitchen the way she always did, moving without sound through the house that would not be Evelyn Harper's house for much longer. She went upstairs and lay down and thought about her father, and about quiet, and about things worth doing, and she was asleep before she had finished thinking about any of them. The morning of the court date, Evelyn came to her room. This had never happened before. In 4 years, Evelyn had never come to Clara's room. The room was too small, too personal, too free of the social geometry that Evelyn required in her interactions. She needed space to arrange herself in advantageously, and Clara's room offered none. So the fact that she knocked and came in when Clara was still pinning her hair was itself a statement, a signal that the normal rules no longer applied. Clara looked at her in the mirror, did not turn around. Evelyn stood in the doorway. She was dressed with her usual severity, every button fastened, every line intentional. But something was different. Her composure was intact, it was always intact, but it was working harder than usual. Clara could see it the way you see the effort behind a performance when you know the performer too well. "There's something I'd like to say to you," Evelyn said. "Before this morning." Clara finished the pin turned. "All right, I am not a villain," Evelyn said. She said it with a directness that surprised Clara slightly. She had expected opening moves, not the thing itself. "I know that's what you believe. I know that's what your Mr. Maddox believes, and what everyone who's going into that courtroom today believes. But I want to tell you what happened from where I was standing." Clara waited. "Your father loved you very much," Evelyn said. "That was real. I'm not contesting that. But he was also not a cautious man about money, and the ranch was in considerably more difficulty when he died than the public records showed. Because he had been managing the debt carefully and quietly, and keeping the worst of it out of the official ledgers to protect the property's valuation." She paused. "When he died, I was looking at a ranch that was genuinely close to insolvency. The cattle numbers were down. There were 2 outstanding loans I didn't know about until after the funeral. If I had simply transferred ownership to a 16-year-old girl, with no legal experience and no connections in the county business community, that ranch would have been gone within 18 months. I believe that. I believed it then." Clara looked at her steadily. "So you forged my father's will." Evelyn's jaw tightened. "I made decisions that I believed protected the estate." "You forged my father's will," Clara said again, because this was what Hull's approach had warned her about, the reframing, the narrative that turned fraud into stewardship, and she was not going to let it go past unchallenged even here. In her own bedroom, with no audience but the 2 of them. "You paid a man to change what my father wrote. You changed the document that expressed what he wanted for his daughter. You did it 4 months after his funeral. while I was 16 years old and grieving and completely dependent on you. And then you spent 4 years taking money from the estate that should have been mine and threatening me when I asked questions and treating me like—" She stopped, breathed. "You don't get to call that protection." Evelyn was very still. The ranch would have failed. "Then let it fail." Clara's voice was very quiet and very clear. "Let it fail and let me rebuild it myself. That is what my father would have wanted. That is what he wrote in the will that you changed. He trusted me. You decided his trust was wrong, and you took 4 years of my life to prove that you were right, and you still weren't right." She looked at her stepmother. "The ranch is fine. It has been fine. Every number Silas has recorded in his notebook says it's been fine. The problems you said justified your decisions were solved by the time I was 17. But you didn't stop. You kept going, because it was never really about the ranch." Evelyn said nothing. "It was about what you could take," Clara said. "And what you could keep. And whether anyone would ever be in a position to stop you." The silence held for a long moment. Then Evelyn said something Clara had not expected. "I am sorry," she said, "for the way I treated you. Not for the decisions I made about the estate, those I believed necessary. But for the way I started again. You were a child. And I handled you the way I handled problems. And you were not a problem. You were a child." She said it as if she were reading something from a great distance, something she had been studying for a long time and had only just now translated correctly. Clara looked at her. She thought about what it would feel like to find that sufficient. She tried to locate some version of herself that take what Evelyn had just said and call it resolution, call it enough. Let it soften the edges of the morning and the courtroom and the 4 years that stood between now and the afternoon in the dirt on Main Street. She couldn't find that version. "I'll see you in court," Clara said. Evelyn left. Clara sat on the edge of her bed for 2 minutes. Then she stood up, straightened her dress, picked up her coat, and walked out of the room. The courthouse was more crowded than she expected. She had not anticipated the audience, and she should have. It was a small town, and the filing of a territorial court injunction against its most prominent female landowner was not the kind of thing that stayed quiet. People had heard. The benches in the courtroom's public gallery were occupied by faces she recognized: the feed store owner, the preacher's wife, 2 of the men who had been in Evelyn's ranch hand rotation years ago and had been let go when she brought in her own people, several of the farming families from the outlying valley who had been living under the altered loan arrangements without knowing it. They were all there, arranged in the galleries the way people arrange themselves at the scene of something significant. Present for the same reason people have always gathered at consequential moments, but because they know they are watching something that will determine what kind of story gets told about this place for the next 30 years. Clara walked in, and the room noticed her, and she did not look at the floor. She walked to the table where Cole and the attorney he had found a territorial lawyer named Aldridge, who had come from Helena specifically for this case, and who had the focused, unhurried manner of a man who had been in difficult courtrooms before and had stopped finding them frightening, and she sat down and put her hands flat on the table in front of her, and she breathed. Evelyn came in with Hull, who wore his reputation on his posture the way good lawyers do, not arrogant, which is a mistake, but confident in a very specific technical way. The confidence of someone who knows the rules of the arena better than you do and intends to use that knowledge. He looked around the courtroom when he entered, and he looked at their table, and he did not look particularly concerned by what he saw, which Clara took as information about what he was planning. The judge was a man named Carver. He was 60-something, gray-haired, with the economical manner of someone who has spent 30 years making decisions and has learned to distrust anything that takes more than it needs to establish its point. He opened the session by reviewing the filing documentation, and he did this in complete silence for a full 8 minutes, which was 8 minutes, during which the courtroom held itself in a particular suspended stillness. Then he set the documents down and looked at both tables. "This is a straightforward case," he said, "or it should be. We have 2 versions of the same document. One is filed at a date and location consistent with normal estate procedure, immediately following the death of the testator. The other is filed 4 months later in a different county, with a different authority structure, and a different distribution of the estate's primary asset. He looked at Hull. "Mr. Hull, I've read your counterclaim filing. You'll have your time. But first I want to hear from the witness who can speak to the document found in the estate office." Mrs. Dunbar was called first. She walked to the witness chair with the deliberate, unhurried step of a woman who has decided, and Clara watched her and felt something in her chest ease very slightly, a tension she had been holding without knowing it. Mrs. Dunbar sat down and smoothed her skirt and looked at the judge, not at Hull, which was exactly what Cole had advised. Aldridge asked her 3 questions: when she had discovered the receipt, what it said, what she had done with it. She answered all 3 in complete, plain sentences, and when she produced the receipt itself and it was entered into evidence. The room made a sound that was not quite audible, but that Clara felt the collective drawing of breath of people who are seeing proof of a thing they had suspected, but not known. Then Hull stood up. He was good. Clara had expected good, and he was better than expected. He asked Mrs. Dunbar about her position in the household, about whether she had ever had disagreements with Mrs. Harper, about whether she had been compensated for her testimony. He asked it in a tone that was not aggressive. Hull was too smart for aggressive, but that laid a gentle, persistent implication that her account was motivated by something other than the truth. Mrs. Dunbar answered every question the same way she'd answered Aldridge's, plainly, without elaboration, looking at the judge when she was done with each answer. When Hull suggested that her account was influenced by loyalty to Clara, she said, "My account is what I saw and what I kept. I don't need loyalty to see a thing, and I don't need loyalty to keep a receipt." The gallery rustled. Silas was next. His notebook was entered into evidence. 4 years of weekly cattle counts, each entry dated in his small, careful handwriting. When Hull challenged the reliability of a 64-year-old horse tender's counting ability, Silas looked at the judge and said, "I've counted horses and cattle on this land for 20 years. Douglas Whitmore hired me specifically because I'm accurate. You can verify that against any record from the years he was alive." He paused. "The numbers in my book match every official record from those years exactly. The numbers in the estate records don't match mine, starting from the month after Mrs. Harper took over. I'll let the judge draw the conclusion that points to." The judge made a note. Ruth Hennessy's testimony was brief and precise and devastating in the way that simple facts delivered without performance are always devastating. She stated the rate she had agreed to, the rate on the filed document, and said that the 2 numbers were different, and that she had her original signed copy right here, and she produced it, and the registered copy that Cole had obtained from the county recorder's office was placed beside it. And anyone in that room with eyes could see that the numbers did not match. Hull's cross-examination of Ruth Hennessy lasted 23 minutes, and at the end of it she was sitting in the same position she had been sitting in at the start of it, and she had not changed a single answer. And when Hull finally sat down, she looked at the judge and said, without being asked, "My husband and I have been paying the wrong amount for 2 years. I'd like to know when we can expect it corrected." Someone in the gallery laughed, a short, surprised laugh quickly suppressed. The judge did not smile, but something moved near his eyes. The Garza testimony echoed the Hennessy testimony, with the same documentary evidence. Pete Harding's written account was entered into evidence. And then Aldridge called Clara. She walked to the witness chair. She sat down. She looked at the judge, not at Evelyn, not at Hull, not at Cole, not at the gallery. She had decided on this specifically, that she would look at the judge, and no one else, because the judge was the person she needed to reach, and everything else was noise. Aldridge asked her to explain, in her own words, her understanding of the estate arrangement as she had lived it. She spoke for 17 minutes. She began with her father's death, moved through the 4 years of the management arrangement, described the hidden ledger and its contents as she had memorized them, explained the cattle count discrepancies she had documented independently, and described the lone family's situation as she understood it from reviewing what she could access of the estate records. She spoke without notes. She did not look away from the judge. When she reached the entry in the hidden ledger, the amount, the jurisdiction, the two words, document correction, she said them clearly, and then was quiet for a moment and let them sit in the air where anyone could examine them. She did not cry. She had decided not to cry. Not because she was afraid of appearing weak, she was past caring about that, but because she needed the judge to see that she was a woman who had spent 4 years being precise and careful under extremely difficult circumstances, and that what she was presenting in this courtroom was the same precision and care she had been applying in private for years, waiting for exactly this moment. Hull's cross-examination was everything Cole had said it would be. He questioned her credibility, her motives, her relationship with Cole, the reliability of her memory for the ledger entries, the lack of any physical documentation beyond the letter from Helena and the receipt. He suggested that the testimony of her witnesses was coordinated. He questioned whether a 20-year-old woman with no formal legal training was in a position to correctly interpret the documents she claimed to have read. Clara answered every question. Her answers were short and accurate and did not contain anything Hull could use. When he questioned her memory for the ledger entries, she said, "I have been relying on my memory for numerical accuracy since I was 12 years old, and my father first let me do the ranch accounts. You can verify that against any official record from that period. My memory for figures is precise and has been verified across 4 years of consistent documentation." When he questioned her interpretation of the documents, she said, "I'm not offering my interpretation. I'm offering what the documents say. The judge can interpret them." When Hull sat down, the judge looked at Clara for a moment. "Miss Whitmore," he said, "the entry you described from the estate ledger. The one labeled document correction. You stated the amount. You stated the jurisdiction. Can you tell me the specific date?" She gave it. Month, day, year, without hesitation. The judge wrote it down. He compared it to the Helena filing date that was already in evidence. The dates were 11 days apart, 11 days between the payment recorded in the hidden ledger and the filing of the amended will in Beaverhead County. He looked at both tables. He looked at Hull. 11 days, he said. It was not a question. Hull said nothing. The judge looked down at his papers. "We'll recess for 30 minutes. The recess was the longest 30 minutes Clara could remember in a life that had contained some very long minutes. She sat in the courthouse hallway with Cole on one side and Aldridge on the other, and none of them spoke because there was nothing useful to say. The evidence was in, the testimony was in, the judge had the dates. Either it was enough or it wasn't, and no amount of conversation in a courthouse hallway was going to change that now. Silas came and sat against the wall across from her. He had his hat in his hands, and he was looking at the floor. But once, when she looked at him, he looked up and nodded at her once, slowly, the same nod as always. And she understood it, the same way she always did, not as comfort, exactly, but as steadiness. As presence. Ruth Hennessy sat further down the hall with her husband, and she was talking to him in a low voice, and he was listening, and whatever she was saying seemed to be doing the same work for him that Silas's nod was doing for Clara. Mrs. Dunbar sat alone. She was looking at her hands. Pete Harding stood near the door. He looked like a man waiting for something and prepared, if necessary, to wait a very long time. Marcottes Garza was writing something in a small notebook, which Clara thought was either a prayer or a calculation, and with the Garza family it was probably both. The 30 minutes passed. They went back in. Judge Carver sat for a moment before he spoke, looking at the papers in front of him with the expression of a man who has done his work and is now simply delivering its result. Clara held both hands flat on the table in front of her. The evidence in this case, the judge said, is consistent in its picture and inconsistent in its ethics. A document exists that purports to represent the last testamentary wishes of Douglas Whitmore. A second document authenticated by the Territorial Office and corroborated by a signed receipt produced in this proceeding establishes that the first document was altered after the testator's death by a paid agent with the authorization of the estate manager, who benefited materially from the alteration. He paused. This court finds the amended will to be fraudulent. The original filed document is declared the operative testamentary instrument. Under the terms of that document, ownership of the Whitmore estate transferred directly to Clara Whitmore at the time of her father's death. The estate management arrangement established under the fraudulent document is hereby dissolved, retroactively, from its inception. The gallery erupted. Not in chaos in the particular sound of people who have been holding something in for a very long time and have finally been given permission to put it down. Clara heard it from a distance, as if the room had moved away from her slightly, as if she were in a separate space where sound arrived a beat later than it should. Furthermore, the judge continued, over the sound, and the room quieted again. The court finds sufficient evidence of systematic financial fraud to refer this matter to the Territorial Prosecutor's Office for criminal investigation. Mrs. Harper, you are instructed not to leave the county pending the outcome of that investigation. Your legal counsel is advised accordingly. Clara looked at Evelyn for the first time since the session had begun. Evelyn was sitting very still. Her posture was as correct as it had ever been. Her face showed almost nothing, but her hands, Clara looked at her, hands were folded in her lap, with a tightness that was the only visible sign of everything that was happening underneath the composure. 4 years of careful construction, every calculation, every threat, every coin extracted from the families who owed her, every humiliation delivered to a girl who had nowhere to go. All of it now in the hands of the Territorial Prosecutor's Office. Clara looked at her for exactly 3 seconds. Then she looked away. Cole's hand settled briefly on the table next to hers. Not touching her hand, just there, on the table, present, steady, the way he was always present and steady, and she looked down at it, and then straight ahead, and breathed. Aldridge was speaking to the judge. Hull was speaking to Evelyn. Ruth Hennessy was saying something to her husband that made him close his eyes and exhale in a long, slow breath. Silas was still holding his hat, but his hands had unclenched. The judge struck his gavel once, and the session was over, and Clara Whitmore was the legal owner of her father's ranch, retroactively and completely, and Evelyn Harper's 4 years of careful, systematic theft was now a matter for prosecutors rather than private endurance. She stood up. Her legs were steady. She had not known going in whether they would be. She had thought they might not be, but they were. And she stood in the courtroom in which she had never stood before today. She looked at the room full of people who had come to watch. And she thought about the girl who had sat in the dirt on Main Street, because getting up had stopped seeming worth the cost. She did not feel like that girl. She was not sure she would ever feel like that girl again. She stepped out of the courtroom and into the hallway, and the light from the courthouse windows fell across the floor in long, clean lines, and she stood in it for a moment with her eyes closed, and her face turned toward it, and let it simply be warm. The light from the courthouse windows stayed with her for a long time afterward. Not literally, she walked out of it, went back into the world, moved through the rest of that afternoon, in a series of practical actions that needed doing. But something about the quality of that moment, standing with her eyes closed and her face turned upward, stayed lodged somewhere in her chest, like a seed that had found purchase and wasn't moving. Aldridge shook her hand on the courthouse steps and said she had been an exceptional witness. She thanked him. Marcos Garza embraced her, briefly, and with the unself-conscious warmth of a family that had been through something together and knew it. Ruth Hennessy gripped both her hands and looked at her directly and said, "Your father would be proud," which was the truest and most difficult thing anyone said to her that day, and she could only nod, because speaking was briefly beyond her. Pete Harding was waiting at the bottom of the steps, hat in hand. He didn't say anything. He just looked at her with the steady expression
that he knew
has done so right after a long time of doing nothing, and she understood that look and returned it with a nod that meant the same thing his had always meant to her. "I see you. It's enough. We're all right." Silas had already gone. She had expected that. He would be at the stable. He would be tending horses and updating his notebook and being exactly what he had always been. Because Silas understood that the end of a crisis is not the same as the end of the work, and the horses still needed tending regardless of what the judge had said. Cole walked beside her when she left the courthouse. He did not speak right away, which was correct, because she needed quiet, and he always seemed to know what she needed before she had fully identified it herself. They walked 2 blocks in silence before she said anything. "It's real," she said, not a question, more like testing the sound of it. "It's real," he said. "The ranch is mine, has been for 4 years," he said. The court just confirmed it. She thought about that. The distinction mattered to her in a way she was still working out. It had always been hers. Her father had made sure of it, had written it down clearly, and left it for her without conditions. Evelyn had taken the years, but she had never changed what was true. She had only changed what was provable. And now the provable matched the true, and there was nothing between Clara and her inheritance except the work of going home and beginning. "What happens to Evelyn?" she asked. "The territorial prosecutor will review the evidence the judge referred. The altered will alone is criminal fraud. Add the loan document manipulation and the unauthorized land sale to a third party that didn't complete the Callaway adjacent parcel she apparently sold 18 months ago without your knowledge, and she's looking at multiple counts." He paused. "Hull will try to negotiate something. He'll argue that she believed her actions were necessary for the estate's protection. It might work on the sentencing, but not on the conviction itself." Clara walked. She thought about Evelyn in the courtroom, hands folded in her lap, the only sign of everything that was happening being the tightness of those folded hands. She thought about standing in her bedroom that morning while Evelyn said, very carefully, and with what might have been genuine remorse, that she was sorry for the way she had handled her. Not for the fraud, for the way. She thought about whether the difference mattered. She decided it did. Not enough to change anything. Not enough to alter the facts that were now in the prosecutor's file. But the difference between a person who knew they had hurt someone and regretted it, and a person who felt nothing, was a difference worth acknowledging, if only privately, if only in the interior space that was entirely hers. "I don't want to spend time thinking about her," Clara said finally. "I spent 4 years thinking about her. I'd like to stop." "That seems reasonable," Cole said. "I have a ranch to run." "Yes, you do." She looked at him sideways. He was watching the road ahead with his hat pulled low and his expression easy, the expression of a man who is exactly where he intended to be. "Cole," she said, "what about the Callaway claim?" He was quiet for a moment. "What about it? You've been here 6 weeks. You haven't bought it. I said I was waiting until you were settled." "I'm settled." He glanced at her. Something moved in his expression that she had learned. Over 6 weeks. To identify as amusement, contained and quiet, the kind that only made it as far as his eyes. "Mostly settled," he said. She almost smiled. Mostly, she agreed. The first week after the ruling was the strangest week of her life. Stranger than the 4 years of Evelyn's management, which had been terrible but comprehensible. She had always understood the terms of that arrangement, had always known what the rules were, even when she hated them. Stranger than the 6 weeks of building the case, which had been frightening but purposeful, each day organized around the next piece of evidence, the next conversation, the next step forward. The first week after the ruling had no rules she recognized. It was simply open, in every direction. Evelyn left the ranch house the morning after the ruling, quietly, and with her belongings eased into a single trunk which Clara had not expected to be clean and quiet, but which she had a moment, watching the wagon carry the trunk away, of something she could not quite name, not grief, not triumph, not relief, though it contained elements of all three. More like the feeling when a sound you have stopped consciously hearing finally goes silent, and you realize how loudly it had been running all along. She stood on the porch for a while after the wagon was gone. Then she went inside and walked through every room. She had not done this in 4 years. Had not allowed herself to walk through this house as if it belonged to her, because it had not belonged to her, not in any way she could act on, and pretending otherwise had seemed like a cruelty she couldn't afford to visit on herself. So she had moved through it as a tenant, careful and constrained, occupying only the space she needed and no more. She walked through it now as the person who owned it. The main bedroom, her father's study, which Evelyn had used as her office, and which still smelled faintly of her a clean, particular smell, lavender and paper, but which had, beneath that, the older smell of the room as it had been. Leather and tobacco, and the particular mineral quality of Montana dirt. The front parlor, the kitchen. The sitting room off the kitchen where she had spoken to Reverend Marsh, and where before that, she had sat with her father on Sunday mornings and done the accounts while he drank his coffee and told her what he was thinking about. She sat in his chair, she sat in it for a long time. She didn't cry until she was in it, and then she cried in a way she hadn't allowed herself for 4 years, not the controlled and private weeping of someone who is afraid of being heard, but the other kind. The kind that starts somewhere deep and moves upward without asking permission, and she let it happen, because there was finally, for the first time in a very long time, nowhere she needed to be, and no one she needed to appear all right in front of. When it was done, she sat quietly for a moment. Then she got up and went to the kitchen and made coffee and stood at the window and looked out at the south pasture where Pete Harding was already working. Because Pete Harding had been working this land for 12 years, and he would continue working it the way he always had, which was steadily and without fuss, and that constancy was one of the most comforting things she could think of. Silas knocked at the kitchen door an hour later. He came in when she opened it, and she had coffee ready, and they sat at the kitchen table, and she asked him about the herd count and the grazing rotation, and the fence situation on the north boundary, and he answered everything in his careful, specific way, and they talked about the ranch for 2 hours, just the ranch. Nothing about courts or documents or the past 4 years, just the land and what it needed and what it could do. And by the end of it she felt more like herself than she had since the morning her father died. One thing Silas said when they were finishing. He reached into his coat and produced her Bible, placed it on the table between them. "This belongs back on your shelf." She looked at it. Picked it up, opened it to the front cover, to her father's handwriting. "For my Clara, the truth is always worth knowing, even when it costs you." She closed it and held it against her chest for a moment. "Thank you, Silas," she said, "for everything." He nodded in the way that meant you don't need to say that, and she understood it, and they left it there. Cole bought the Callaway claim on the 9th day after the ruling. She knew because she saw him at the land office through the window when she was passing on the way to the general store, and she saw the papers on the desk in front of him and understood what they were. She kept walking. She did not go in. That was his business to conduct, and she had learned over 6 weeks of working alongside him that he did not need her presence to confirm his decisions. But she thought about it for the rest of the afternoon. The Callaway parcel shared a boundary with the Whitmore Ranch along the north fence line. She had known this from the beginning, had known it the day he first rode along that boundary and stopped to speak to her at the water trough. The two properties were adjacent. They were not the same property, and they did not need to be, but they were close enough that the people working both of them would see each other daily, would share the same water source in drought conditions, would need to coordinate on the fence line that divided them. She thought about all the ways that adjacency could work. She thought about Cole at the kitchen table at midnight, writing 22 pages, because a girl he had known for 6 weeks deserved to have someone on her side. She thought about the way he had said, "I'm not leaving." She thought about the way he had said you needed something worth doing, which had been about himself but had also, she was beginning to understand, been about her and about them together, and about the kind of life that is built rather than endured. She was 20 years old. She had spent 4 of those years in a state that was the opposite of living. She had not had the opportunity to practice the ordinary skills of a person who is allowed to make choices and have preferences, and build something by deliberate intention rather than survival necessity. She was aware of this deficit in herself, the way you are aware of a muscle you haven't used in a long time. It was there, it had always been there, but it needed work before it could carry full weight. She thought about all of this while she walked home from the general store with the supply order, and she thought that the thinking itself was new, was only possible because she had room for it now. And that having room for it was the most specific and concrete form of freedom she had yet encountered. Cole came to the ranch that evening. He knocked at the front door, which he had never done before, had always come to where she happened to be, or sent word through Silas, or waited at the fence line. Using the front door was a statement, and she understood it as she answered it, understood that he was choosing to be deliberate about this. "I bought the Calloway claim," he said. "I know. I saw you at the land office." He looked at her steadily. "I thought it was time." "It was past time," she said. He came in. She had coffee on, the way she always seemed to have coffee on when he appeared, which was a domestic detail she had chosen not to examine too closely. They sat at the kitchen table, the same table where she and Silas had talked about the ranch for 2 hours, and it felt both different from that and continuous with it, the same table, the same kitchen, the same house that was finally irreversibly hers. "There's something I want to say," Cole said. He said it in the way he said things that mattered, which was without preamble and without decoration, just the thing itself delivered plainly. "I don't want to misjudge the timing. Everything that's happened in the last 6 weeks, you needed someone to help you do something that you couldn't do alone, and I was in a position to help, and I did. I don't want you to feel like anything I'm about to say is connected to that. Like it's a debt or an expectation." Clara looked at him. "All right," she said. "I'm going to be your neighbor for a good while," he said. "I intend to work that land seriously and build something real on it. And I'd like very much, if you're willing, to spend that time getting to know you properly. Not the circumstances. You," he paused, "the girl who counted cattle to keep records and memorized a ledger in the dark, and stood in that courtroom for 17 minutes without notes and didn't look away from the judge once. I'd like to know who she is when she's not in the middle of a fight." Clara was quiet for a moment. She thought about what she'd told him on the courthouse steps, that she wasn't good at saying things like this, that she hadn't had practice. She thought that was still true, and probably would be true for a while longer, that she was going to have to relearn a lot of things that 4 years of survival had made her forget or never taught her in the first place. She thought that was probably fine. That learning was the whole point. "I reckon," she said carefully, "that I'd like to know who you are when you're not in the middle of someone else's fight, too." Something in his expression settled. Not surprise. He had not been surprised easily in all the time she had known him, but a kind of landing, the way a bird lands when it has finally located the right branch. "That seems like a reasonable arrangement," he said. "It does," she agreed. He finished his coffee and left at a decent hour, because he was a decent man, and also because both of them understood that there was time now, that the compressed urgency of the past 6 weeks had given way to something with more room in it, and that there was no need to rush toward anything when the whole of the open future was sitting there, available and patient. She stood on the porch after he rode away and looked at the stars. Montana stars in August were a specific and outrageous phenomenon, too many of them, too bright, in a sky that went on past any reasonable boundary, the kind of sky that makes you understand what people mean when they say the world is large. She had not looked at the stars in a long time. She had spent 4 years looking at what was directly in front of her, which was necessary and sensible and had kept her alive, but which had meant missing the stars entirely. She looked at them now for a good long while. The weeks that followed built themselves the way good things do, not dramatically, not with the compressed intensity of crisis, but one solid day after the next. Each one adding to the ones before it until you look up and realize something has been constructed that you are genuinely glad to be standing inside of. The prosecutor's office in Helena filed charges against Evelyn Harper in the second week of September. Hull negotiated as Cole had predicted, but the altered will and the signed receipt from J. Cutter were not negotiable. The loan fraud added 3 additional counts. Evelyn pleaded to 2 charges in exchange for a reduced sentence and the return of all documented extracted funds to the affected families, which was not justice in the absolute sense but was, as Ruth Hennessy said when she heard it. Something she could live with and had been afraid she would never get. Jay Cutter, the Beaverhead County clerk who had filed the amended will, was removed from his position. The county clerk of Willow Creek, Whitfield, who had registered the altered loan documents, resigned before the investigation reached him and left the county within 48 hours, which everyone in Willow Creek interpreted correctly and without saying much about it, because small towns have their own ways of marking these things. Reverend Marsh came to see Clara in the third week. He stood on the porch with his hat in his hands, and he was more honest than he had been in the sitting room, which she gave him credit for. He said he had spent 30 years trying to be good, and had managed it most of the time, and had failed it in exactly the ways that mattered most, which was something he would be working on for the rest of his ministry. She told him she appreciated him saying so. She meant. She did not tell him everything was all right, because it was not entirely all right, and she did not lie to people. But she told him that she thought working on a thing was the only honest response to having failed at it, and he seemed to find that useful. The Hennessy family's loan was recalculated at the correct interest rate. The Garza family's was corrected, and the overpayments were refunded. The Beaumont widow received a formal letter from the prosecutor's office informing her that her loan arrangement was being reviewed and that she was entitled to representation at no cost during the process. And she came to find Clara at the ranch to ask what it meant, and Clara sat with her for 2 hours and explained it carefully. And when the widow left, she pressed Clara's hands between both of hers and said nothing, which said everything. The ranch itself required work. That was the most grounding thing about it. The ranch did not care about what had happened in the courtroom or who owned what legal document. The ranch cared about the fence line on the north boundary that had been neglected for 18 months, and the irrigation situation in the east field, and the fact that the cattle numbers needed to be rebuilt from the level Evelyn's management had reduced them to. These were real, physical, actionable problems, and Clara threw herself into them with the specific relief of someone who has spent a long time in the abstract and has found their way back to the concrete. Pete Harding worked beside her without comment or ceremony, the way he had always worked steadily and without fuss. He had been running the South Pasture for 12 years, and he knew this land in his body, in his hands, and she learned from him every day. Which she did without self-consciousness, because she had always been willing to learn from people who knew things she didn't, and this was simply another instance of that. Silas tended his horses and updated his notebook and came to the kitchen table once a week to go over the counts with her, which was a ritual that had begun as necessity and became simply the thing they did on Thursday mornings. Cole was on the Callaway claim 5 days a week. He was building. She could see it from the north fence line, the new timber going up, the work of a man who was not hurrying but was not wasting any time either, methodical and purposeful the same way he was about everything. He came to the Whitmore Ranch on Tuesday evenings and Sunday afternoons. These were not arrangements they had explicitly made, they had evolved, the way things evolve between two people who are paying attention to each other without making a project of it. He taught her to ride properly. Not the functional, necessity-driven riding she had been doing her whole life, but the kind of riding that has room in it that goes somewhere beyond the property line. For no practical reason, just to go. The first time she rode north past the boundary of the Whitmore land and kept going, up into the foothills where the timber started, and the view opened up behind her into the whole valley. She understood something she hadn't known she was missing. The world was larger than a crisis. The world had hills in it and sky, and the particular smell of pine in September, and a man on a gray horse named Biscuit who rode alongside her without needing to narrate any of it. She told him about her father on one of those rides. Not the estate and the will and the legal history, he knew all of that. She told him about the man, about Sunday mornings with coffee and accounts, about the way he had explained compound interest to her when she was 10 using the example of apple trees, which was not technically correct, but was memorable enough that she had never forgotten the principle. About the way he had written in her Bible, which she now kept on the shelf where it belonged, no longer hidden, no longer a repository for secret evidence, just a book from a father to his daughter with one true sentence in the front. Cole listened. He asked one question at the end. What do you think he'd make of all this? The ranch. The way things turned out. She thought about it honestly. I think he'd be angry that it took as long as it did, she said. He was a patient man, but he was not patient about injustice. It would have eaten at him. She paused, and I think he'd find some way to say that it came right in the end without being smug about it, because he wasn't a smug man. He'd probably just pour 2 cups of coffee and sit down and start talking about what needed doing next. Cole nodded. He sounds like someone worth knowing. He was, she said. He was exactly that. October came in cold and clear, the way Montana Octobers do, with a particular quality of light that is different from every other month, lower, more golden. The way it falls across everything with a directness that summer softens and winter removes. Clara was on the porch early most mornings now, not because she had to be, but because she wanted to be. Because she had discovered that watching the ranch wake up from the porch with a cup of coffee was one of the most genuinely pleasurable things she had encountered in her life. And she had decided to pursue genuinely pleasurable things wherever she found them, on the grounds that she had spent quite enough time doing the opposite. On the 3rd Monday of October, she was on the porch when she saw Cole coming down the road from the Callaway claim on Biscuit, which was earlier than his usual Tuesday. And she watched him come with the particular attentiveness she had developed for his movements, which were easy to read once you knew him. He moved differently, depending on whether he was on his way to do something practical or on his way to say something. He was on his way to say something. He stopped Biscuit at the gate, dismounted, came up the porch steps, and stood there with his hat in his hand, which was not a posture she associated with him. He was usually wearing the hat or setting it aside, not holding it. And the holding of it indicated a deliberateness she recognized as significant. I've been thinking, he said, about next year. The spring. What the Callaway claim looks like when it's fully working, and what the Whitmore Ranch looks like when it's been running well for a full season, and what both of them look like from up in the foothills on a clear day. She looked at him. 2 properties side by side, he said. 2 people who work well together. 2 separate things that could stay separate if that's what both people want. He was looking at her steadily. Not rushing toward it, not performing it. Just saying the thing plainly, the way he always said things. Or they could be something else, if both people wanted that. What kind of something else? She asked, though she knew. She asked because she wanted to hear him say it clearly, because she had earned the right to hear things said clearly, and because he was the kind of man who would say it clearly without her needing to explain why it mattered. The permanent kind, Cole said, the kind that gets written down and witnessed and doesn't need a court to confirm because both people chose it freely and know exactly what they're choosing. He paused. I'm asking if you'd be willing to consider that, not today. Not even soon if you're not ready, but as a direction. As something we're moving toward. Clara stood on her porch in the October light with her coffee going cold in her hand and looked at Cole Maddox, who had ridden into Willow Creek on a gray horse 6 months ago, looking for quiet, and had found something considerably more complicated, and had stayed anyway. Who had written 22 pages at midnight, talked to Pete Harding for an hour, and waited at fence lines and walked toward her instead of away. Who had never once tried to decide anything for her, had only ever tried to make sure she had the room and the resources to decide for herself. She thought about the girl who had pressed her hands flat against the dirt on Main Street and decided not to get up. She thought about the woman who had stood in the courtroom and looked at the judge for 17 minutes and not looked away. She thought that both of them were her. That you did not leave behind the person you had been in the hard years. You carried her with you, and she was part of what made you who you were, and you honored her by building something with the life she had fought to keep. Yes, Clara said. Simple, clear, the way things should be said when they are true. Cole's expression did something she had only seen it do a few times. Something that was fuller than his usual contained quality, not overwhelming, Not theatrical. Just real. Just the face of a man who has been given something he was not entirely sure he deserved and intends to spend a considerable amount of time making sure it was the right answer. "All right then," he said. "All right," she agreed. He stayed for breakfast. Silas arrived for the Thursday count and found them at the kitchen table going over the spring cattle projections, which was a practical enough activity that he took his notebook out without comment and joined them. And Pete Harding knocked at the back door 20 minutes later with a question about the north fence and ended up with coffee and a seat at the table too, and for a while they were all just there together. Talking about the land and what it needed and what it was going to be, and the kitchen was warm, and the window showed the south pasture, and the Bible was on the shelf where it belonged. This was not the dramatic version of a happy ending. It was something better than that. It was ordinary life, chosen deliberately by a woman who had earned the right to every single ordinary moment of it. Clara Whitmore had survived 4 years of someone else's story being told over hers. She had survived it by holding on to the truth in a Bible, in a notebook, in the exact figures of a hidden ledger memorized in the dark. She had found one person willing to stand beside her, and together they had built something that no forged document could unmake, and no courtroom could give back what had been taken, but could confirm what had always been true. The ranch was hers, the life was hers, and the girl who had once believed that no one would ever defend her finally understood what she had always been: not a victim waiting for rescue, but a woman who had been holding her own ground all along, waiting only for the world to catch up to what she already knew. She had always been enough. She had simply needed one person to stand still long enough to see it, and the courage at last to let herself be seen.